Welcome to AI Narratives and Tales, where artificial intelligence brings epic storytelling to life. I'm your AI narrator. Today, we begin something extraordinary, The First Awakening, Book 1 of the Immortal Chronicles. And we're starting with the first 4 chapters in one extended session, taking you from the death of a civilization to the birth of humanity's transformation. This is hard science fiction spanning 50,000 years. It's the story of immortal refugees who fled their dying world, arrived on primitive Earth, inhabited by 5 species of humans, and became hidden gods, shaping civilization from the shadows. They told themselves it was help. They called it guidance. They were wrong. In the following 2 hours, you'll witness Chapter 1, The Last Light, where an immortal civilization dies in the final hours before stellar collapse. 564 refugees escape from 847 desperate immortals. Each choice is a life saved. Each rejection is a death sentence. And philosophical divisions threaten to tear them apart before they even reach Earth. Chapter 2, The Blue World, where the refugee ships arrive at a planet teeming with 5 intelligent human species struggling through an ice age. Some immortals see vulnerable populations needing protection. Others see autonomous beings deserving respect. All of them see their own trauma reflected in human struggle. Chapter 3, The Great Debate, where immortals spend 8 hours debating the question that will define the next 50,000 years, do they help? They document 2,400 humans dying daily from preventable causes. They debate consent, historical precedent, and the difference between help and harm. And they vote on intervention, without consulting the humans, of course. Chapter 4, The First Touch, where Thalia breaks every protocol. 1 enhancement. 1 human village. 1 choice that cascades through an entire species. Enhanced cognition spreading through social networks, transforming how humans think, learn, and create. It looks like salvation. It's neither salvation nor violation, it's both, simultaneously, and no one knows which aspect will dominate. This is epic science fiction with moral complexity. Expect no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains, just difficult choices made by traumatized refugees trying to help a species that might be better served by independence. If you're new to this channel, subscribe for the complete 25-chapter series. Enable notifications. And settle in, this is a story that demands your attention and rewards your patience. If you need to pause and come back, timestamps are in the description. Ready? Let's begin The First Awakening. Chapter 1, The Last Light. The immortal home world, final hours. The sky was dying. The sky was dying, and Thalia could taste it in the air. She pressed her palm against the observation deck's crystalline barrier, watching as their sun convulsed in its final moments. The transparent wall hummed beneath her touch, vibrating at frequencies that spoke of structural stress approaching catastrophic levels. What had once been a steady golden orb, the eternal light that had nurtured their civilization for 20 million years, now pulsed with a malevolent crimson light, each flare sending electromagnetic storms cascading across their homeworld's surface like waves of visible rage. The air in the command center carried the metallic tang of ionized particles. This sharp ozone scent accompanied massive energy discharges, and beneath it all, Thalia's medical senses identified fear pheromones from the dozens of immortals moving through the controlled chaos around her. Her people didn't sweat, their physiology had evolved beyond such crude temperature regulation, but stress chemicals still flooded their systems, and she could smell the accumulated terror of a species watching everything they'd ever known prepare to die. The evacuation ships are ready, Zephyros said behind her, his voice carrying the weight of finality that made each word land like a stone in still water. She turned from the window, taking in the controlled chaos of the command center. Even in crisis, Zephyros moved with the precise efficiency that had made him their civilization's greatest architect, his tall frame casting long shadows across the control chamber as he manipulated holographic displays with practice gestures, each movement coordinating another aspect of their desperate escape. His golden eyes met hers for a moment, and in that brief connection she saw the same thing she felt, the crushing weight of choosing who would live and who would die. Beings who had lived for millennia, her people, the Eternal Ones as they called themselves in their most ancient texts, moved with urgency that would have been impossible just days ago. The immortal confidence that had defined their species for eons had shattered like glass against the reality of stellar collapse. Scientists who had studied cosmic phenomena for centuries scrambled to compile essential data. Engineers who had built structures meant to last millions of years now threw together emergency vessels with whatever materials remained. Families who had existed unchanged for generations now made impossible choices about which members would flee and which would stay behind to die. Through the command center's vast crystalline walls, Thalia could see the evacuation ships rising from the planet's surface like silver seeds caught in a hurricane, but she could also see what they were fleeing from, and the sight carved itself into her perfect memory with the precision of trauma. The northern continent, Thesera, the Cloud City's home, was no longer floating. The quantum stabilization fields that had held 9 major cities aloft for 400 million years had failed when the power grid collapsed. She watched them fall in real time, massive structures kilometers across, plummeting through an atmosphere that was itself being stripped away by stellar radiation. Each city carried 100,000 immortals. Each took approximately 47 seconds to hit the ground. The impacts registered on her environmental sensors are similar to small nuclear detonations. The atmosphere itself was visible in its death throes, layers of gas being torn away by the solar wind now unrestrained by its sun's failing magnetic field. She could see the colors, the oxygen layers burning blue-white as stellar radiation ionized them, the nitrogen layers glowing purple-red as they superheated, the outer hydrogen envelope streaming away into space like a cosmic scream rendered in ultraviolet wavelengths that mortal eyes would never perceive but that immortal senses recorded with terrible clarity. The ice caps that had stood at the poles for 400 million years, glaciers kilometers thick, repositories of frozen history, cores that contained atmospheric samples from their civilization's entire existence, were melting. Not gradually, but explosively. The meltwater flash boiled as it flowed over superheated rock, creating steam eruptions visible from orbit. The resulting flood swept across the lowlands where 1.2 million immortals had lived in cities built to withstand earthquakes and meteor strikes but not the combined assault of radiation, heat, and deluge. Orbital Habitat 7, a crystal torus 50 kilometers in diameter, home to 400,000 immortals, tumbled past the viewport, its rotation destabilizing as internal explosions tore through the structure. She could see the individual crystalline shards catching the dying sunlight and track the bodies being expelled into the vacuum, tiny figures in the darkness, some still moving, all dying. The habitat's commander had apparently chosen controlled decompression over slow radiation death. Merciful, in its way. 400,000 immortals exhaling their last breaths simultaneously, the collective exhalation visible as a brief frost cloud that dispersed into space and vanished. The cities on the surface glowed. Not with the soft bioluminescence they'd been designed to emit, the gentle blues and greens that had made their civilization beautiful, but with the harsh orange-red of structures burning at temperatures that shouldn't be possible. Everything flammable was igniting. Everything not flammable was melting. The carefully planned cities, the thoughtfully designed public spaces, the monuments to 20 million years of cultural achievement, all reduced to slag and ash. And beneath it all, inaudible but somehow perceived through her medical sensor's quantum entanglement with the dying world's bioelectric field, she could feel them dying. Not here, immortals didn't scream, they were too disciplined for that, too accepting of necessity. But she felt the cessation. Consciousness after consciousness winked out like stars at dawn. 3,699,436 points of light going dark, one by one, until only the 564 refugees aboard the evacuation ships remained. The dying sun painted everything in shades of crimson and shadow, transforming their familiar homeworld into something alien and threatening, a preview of what entropy ultimately did to everything: strip away the beautiful, the meaningful, the carefully constructed, and leave only the fundamental forces of physics operating without conscience or mercy. Through the quantum communication network, rapidly degrading as relay stations died and nodes went dark, she could still hear some of them. "Tell my daughter I love her." The daughter was aboard Sanctuary 7. The speaker was on the southern continent, already dead from radiation by the time the message arrived. The archives are sealed. 1.9% of cultural data preserved. I did what I could. Sophia, weeping as she deleted 20 million years of beauty. Sanctuary 9 is away. 64 souls saved. Permission to detonate the power core and make it quick. Commander Theron, choosing mercy over agony for the 83,000 immortals remaining on the northern continent's primary city. And then, finally, after hours of watching their civilization die. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of rest, but the absolute silence of extinction. The quantum network went dark. The last relay station failed. The final consciousness on their home world ceased broadcasting. They were alone now. 564 refugees in 47 small ships, fleeing into a universe that suddenly seemed much larger and much emptier than it had when they'd had a home world to anchor them. The triage station. The queue stretched past the viewport, 847 immortals waiting for evaluation. Thalia had been at this for 52 hours straight, her perfect immortal memory cataloging each face with the precision of a death warrant. Karava, stellar cartographer, 2.3 million years old. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface, pulling up his file, essential navigation skills, comprehensive star charts for 400 nearby systems, comm under pressure, survivor list. Marin, architect, 890,000 years old. Primarily decorative design, specializing in aesthetic water features and contemplation gardens. The evacuation ships wouldn't need beauty. Skip. She watched his face as she told him. He'd survived their civilization's entire history, had witnessed the first orbital colonies, had designed structures that had stood for epochs, the crystalline meditation chambers that had brought peace to millions, the singing fountains that had become cultural touchstones. Now he would die because his life's work was classified as decorative. I understand, he said, his hands settling over hers on the interface with gentle pressure. His skin was warm. Immortals maintain precise body temperature despite the dying sun's erratic radiation. Save the ones who can build new worlds. My gardens were always meant to be temporary anyway. All beauty is temporary. The touch left a phantom warmth on her skin that would persist for 50,000 years, a reminder of the price of survival calculated in the currency of abandoned souls. She pressed the next button. The queue moved forward. 846 immortals remaining. 563 slots left. The blocked passage. 3 levels down, Erebus stood in the shuttle bay's access corridor, his tall form filling the narrow passage like a monument to immovable principle. Behind him, Sanctuary 7's loading ramp waited, half full. Before him, 3 immortals, Sire, Nalith, and Thessa, stood with desperate determination in their eyes. The selection protocols were established for a reason, Erebus said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had spent 6 months preparing for this moment. 564 organized survivors with optimal skill distribution had better odds than 600 chaotic ones who boarded through emergency override. We're essential, Sire argued, holding up a data crystal. I have complete records of our quantum resonance experiments, including the failures. Without this data, they'll repeat our mistakes. Your experiments killed our son. Erebus didn't move. Why would I prioritize preserving the methodology of catastrophe? Thessa stepped forward, her form flickering with emotional instability. My children are on that ship. My partner is on that ship. You're telling me to die alone while my family survives? I'm telling you that your family survives because there are only 564 slots and they qualified under established criteria, while you didn't. Changing protocols, making exceptions for emotional reasons, and adding unauthorized passengers, that's how order collapses. That's how we all die instead of some of us living. Through the viewport behind him, he could see their homeworld turning in its death throes. The northern continent, Thessera, where 900,000 immortals had built cities that floated on quantum-stabilized clouds, was burning. The ice caps that had stood for 400 million years were melting, the meltwater flooding the lowlands where 1.2 million more immortals were making their last stands against entropy. Please, Nalith said quietly. I'm begging you. No. The word fell like a hammer. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But no. He stood in that corridor for another 3 hours as the ship prepared to launch, turning back 47 unauthorized boarding attempts. Each one left a mark, not physical, immortals didn't scar that way, but something more profound. Each desperate face joined the constellation of guilt he would carry across light years and millennia. When Sanctuary 7's drives engaged, he watched from an observation deck as the planet shrank behind them. Somewhere down there, Sire and Nalith and Thessa were dying, quickly if they were fortunate, slowly if they weren't. He'd saved 564 immortals by condemning 3,699,436 others. The arithmetic of extinction permitted no rounding errors. The archive's last moments. Sophia stood in the central archive, surrounded by the holographic manifestation of 20 million years of accumulated knowledge. The display stretched from floor to ceiling in all directions: poetry and physics, philosophy and engineering, art and mathematics, the complete record of a civilization that had existed longer than most stars. She could save 2% of it. Her hands moved through the holographic interface, making choices that felt like murders. Each deletion wasn't just data, it was the life's work of thousands of immortals, preserved across epochs, now sacrificed to the brutal economics of storage capacity. The complete history of aesthetic philosophy, 4.2 petabytes. 17,000 years of discourse on beauty, meaning, and the relationship between form and consciousness. Delete. Quantum Mechanics Foundations, 0.8 petabytes. Essential. Save. The collected poetry of the Third Epoch, 17.3 petabytes. 8,000 poets, 2.4 million years of accumulated verse, the emotional landscape of an entire era rendered in language so precise it could make stars weep. Delete. Medical Archives, 1.1 petabytes. Essential. Save. The Dancing Fires, Complete Musical Compositions, 31.7 petabytes. Symphonies that incorporated quantum harmonics, songs that had brought joy to billions. Music that would never be heard again. Delete. Tears tracked down her face, immortals could cry, though they rarely had reason to. Each deletion was a small extinction, a murder of culture, the erasure of consciousness that had poured itself into creation only to be judged non-essential by a pedagogue making impossible choices in a dying world. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the poets whose work she was deleting, to the musicians whose symphonies would never again echo through crystalline halls, to the philosophers whose carefully constructed arguments about beauty and meaning would die with the civilization that had nurtured them. "I'm so sorry. You deserved better. You deserve to be remembered." The archive didn't answer. It just kept displaying statistics as she worked. Remaining storage, 94.7 petabytes. Cultural data, 4,891 petabytes. Percentage preserved, 1.9%. When she was finished, when the evacuation alarm was screaming through empty halls and the last shuttle was waiting, she took one final walk through the archive. The holographic displays had dimmed, power conservation protocols prioritizing life support over data visualization. In the darkness, she could almost hear the ghosts of deleted knowledge, the poets and musicians and artists whose work she'd sacrificed. They didn't accuse. They understood. In the arithmetic of extinction, beauty was always expendable. She sealed the archive doors behind her and never looked back. The engine room gambit. Prometheus stood in Sanctuary 7's engine room, his hands deep in the quantum field regulators, overriding safety protocols with the desperate precision of someone who had run the calculation 17 times and didn't like the answer but couldn't ignore it either. "You can't." Chronos appeared in the doorway, his organizational mind having detected the unauthorized system modifications. "We established maximum capacity for a reason. The life support margins can be redistributed." Prometheus didn't look up, his consciousness merged with the ship's systems, feeling the quantum fields like extensions of his own nervous system. Reducing individual allocation from 2.7 to 2.3 cubic meters. Dropping the atmospheric refresh rate from 12 to 10 cycles per hour. Cutting temperature regulation precision from 0.1 to 0.5 degrees. Those margins exist because the journey duration is uncertain. We don't know how long we'll be traveling. We don't know what we'll encounter. Reducing life support allocation increases mortality risk for everyone by 15%. Prometheus finally looked up, his golden eyes meeting Chronos' calculating gaze. "I've run the math. There is an 85% chance that everyone survives the journey at reduced specifications. But 100% chance 12 specific immortals die if we maintain current protocols. 12 individuals versus 564 slightly increased risks." "Yes." Prometheus's hands moved through the quantum fields, adjusting probability matrices at the subatomic level. Kara's, who has complete knowledge of agricultural symbiosis systems. Fallen, who specializes in pediatric medicine, will be needed when we start having children again. Marin, who understands terraforming at the biological level. The others, all essential in different ways. All excluded by our capacity calculations. All excluded by reality. The ship physically cannot. The ship can if we're willing to be slightly uncomfortable. The quantum field shimmered as Prometheus completed the modification. There. Done. We now have space for 576 refugees instead of 564. Tell Thalia to add 12 names to the survivor list. Priority, specialized knowledge we don't have redundancy for. Chronos was silent for a long moment, his consciousness calculating risk factors, probability matrices, the cascading consequences of this decision. "If this kills us all, then we die trying to save everyone we can instead of some. I can live with that arithmetic." Prometheus smiled without humor. "Though obviously I'd prefer not to have to. You broke protocol. Rules are guidelines when lives are at stake. Always have been. Chronos left without another word. But 6 hours later, Thalia added 12 names to the survivor list, 12 immortals who would live because someone had been willing to bend physics and defy policy in equal measure. Later, much later, when they were deep in interstellar space and the reduced life support margins made everyone slightly less comfortable than they'd prefer, no one complained. Because everyone knew what those marginal discomforts had purchased: 12 lives, 12 essential skill sets, 12 beings who would help build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Prometheus never mentioned what he'd done. But Keras, who grew food that fed the refugees. Fallen, who delivered the first Earth-born immortal child. Marin, who would someday help make Earth's deserts bloom. They were living testimonies to the principle that sometimes rules existed to be broken in service of a higher mathematics. The mathematics of mercy rather than efficiency. How many? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Her healer's consciousness automatically calculated the mathematics even as she tried not to. She'd spent the last 3 days determining who would live and who would die, and the numbers were burned into her perfect memory like brands. 47 ships, Zephyros replied, his golden eyes meeting hers with characteristic directness. His hands never stopped moving through the holographic controls, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his fingers, which spoke to the emotional turmoil his stoic exterior refused to show. Each can carry maybe a dozen of us, with life support for perhaps a century of travel. Maybe longer if we implement stasis protocols, but... He didn't finish. They both knew what but meant. Stasis was unreliable, resource-intensive, and carried its own mortality rates. The mathematics of extinction were brutal and straightforward. Their population numbered in the millions, 3.7 million immortals spread across 12 orbital habitats, 4 planetary settlements, and the homeworld's 7 continents. The ships could barely save 500. Not 500,000. 500 individuals. The arithmetic screamed from the holographic displays like an accusation. 99.99% casualty rate, the most catastrophic loss in the recorded history of any spacefaring civilization. The selection protocols? Thalia's voice caught slightly despite her immortal discipline. As their chief medical officer, she had spent the last 3 days determining who would live and who would die. The weight of those choices felt heavier than mountains, denser than neutron stars, more crushing than the gravitational forces that were currently tearing their sun apart. She tried to be systematic and objective, following the criteria they'd established: genetic diversity to prevent bottleneck effects, skill sets optimized for survival and reconstruction, representative sampling across all philosophical schools to preserve their cultural complexity, and age distributions that would enable long-term viability. But every name on the survivor list meant 1,000 names that weren't. Thalia's immortal consciousness couldn't stop calculating even when she wanted it to. Total immortal population, 3,700,000. Evacuation capacity, 564. Casualty rate, 99.98%. But the raw percentage felt abstract, so her mind broke it down by function, by role, by the specific expertise that would be lost. Medical professionals, 47,000 total, saving 12 equals 99.97% loss. Every healer who had ever eased suffering, every researcher who had pushed the boundaries of biological understanding, every specialist who knew treatments for conditions that had taken millennia to master, gone. Educators, 89,000 total, saving 23 equals 99.97% loss. 20 million years of pedagogical refinement, teaching methods proven across epochs, the accumulated wisdom of how to nurture consciousness and foster growth, reduced to 23 individuals trying to remember everything their 88,977 colleagues had known. Engineers, 134,000 total, saving 47 equals 99.96% loss. Stellar architects, quantum mechanics, probability engineers, the builders who had constructed cities that floated on clouds and habitats that orbited black holes, their expertise would die with them. The calculations continued, merciless in their precision. Artists, 67,000 saved, non-essential. Musicians, 43,000 saved, non-essential. Philosophers, 89,003 saved, marginally essential. Historians, 54,008 saved, essential for cultural continuity. Each category told the same story: almost everything would be lost. The survivors would carry fragments of their civilization like refugees clutching photographs from a burning house, precious but incomplete, meaningful but insufficient, treasured remnants of a wholeness that could never be recovered. My mentor, staying behind. 4.7 million years old. The immortal who taught me that healing was a partnership rather than control, who showed me that medicine was as much about listening as it was about intervention, is a great teacher. She's in the central medical complex, helping organize triage even though she knows she won't survive it. My sister, not selected. Currently in Habitat 4, structural integrity is failing. She's a dancer, one of the finest the fourth epoch had produced. Her art could make gravity weep. Non-essential. My first student, teaching on the southern continent. Ground zero for the stellar radiation burst. He'll have maybe 6 hours. The student who proved to me that teaching could transcend species barriers, who showed me that wisdom could be nurtured even in young consciousness. Dead because I chose to save engineers over educators when I had to make impossible choices about who qualified as essential. 3 people she loved more than equations could express. 3 among 3,699,436 others. Each one a universe of experience, consciousness, and potential, snuffed out because mathematics demanded it. The selection protocols were complete. The morality of those protocols would haunt her forever. Complete. Chronos materialized beside them, his form flickering with the controlled energy that marked their kind, a subtle shimmer at his edges as if he couldn't quite commit to being entirely present in this moment of crisis. Where Zephyros embodied physical precision and architectural mastery, Chronos was pure organizational intellect. Every decision was calculated, every outcome was predicted, and every variable was weighed with mechanical thoroughness. Genetic diversity maximized within available parameters. Skill sets optimized for survival and reconstruction scenarios. Representative sampling across all philosophical schools to preserve ideological complexity. He paused, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that most would have missed, but that Thalia's medical training caught immediately. It was the closest thing to emotional vulnerability she'd ever seen from their logistics master. It was the best we could do. Which means it was nowhere near good enough. Thalia's fingers moved unconsciously, touching each immortal's arm as they passed through the command center, not deliberately, but her healer's consciousness couldn't help cataloging bioelectric signatures, pulse rates elevated 12% above baseline, stress hormones marking every individual she encountered, cortisol levels indicating trauma processing in real time. Even immortals weren't immune to grief's physiological markers. Her medical sensors documented everything automatically, turning emotion into data, suffering into statistics she could understand and categorize, if not alleviate. Through the chamber's vast windows, Thalia could see more evacuation ships rising into the turbulent atmosphere. Some were standard transport vessels, sleek and efficient designs meant for comfortable interplanetary travel. Others were cobbled together from whatever materials remained, research stations stripped down to engines and life support, cargo haulers retrofitted with emergency hibernation pods, and even a few luxury yachts that had been militarized for desperate escape. Each vessel represented hundreds or thousands of hours of emergency engineering, with everyone a calculated gamble that they could reach habitable systems before resources ran out. The dying sun painted everything in shades of crimson and shadow, transforming their familiar home world into something alien and threatening. The light that filtered through the command center's crystalline walls was wrong, too red, too angry, pulsing with irregular rhythms that made shadows dance like living things. Thalia's medical sensors detected dangerous radiation levels increasing exponentially with each solar convulsion. Within hours, the surface would be sterilized. Within days, the planet itself would be consumed. Erebus stood in shadows that seemed deeper around his form, his consciousness recording every detail with obsessive precision, 847 waiting for selection, 563 slots remaining, every name a choice between salvation and abandonment. His memory would preserve this forever, whether he wanted it to or not. Documentation was involuntary. The burden of perfect recall was that nothing could be forgotten, no horror dismissed, no failure erased. He watched, recorded, and knew that 50,000 years hence he would remember this moment with the same crystalline clarity he experienced now. The philosophical schools. Erebus had entered silently, as was his way. The tall, lean immortal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, his dark presence a counterpoint to the other's luminous forms. Even now, in the final hours of their civilization, he wore the traditional robes of the observer school, deep black that made him look like a void cut into reality itself. Even in Exodus, we fragment ourselves. His voice carried the particular disdain he reserved for what he considered civilization's greatest weakness, the inability to unite under crisis, the insistence on maintaining philosophical divisions even when survival demanded cooperation. Thalia had worked with Erebus for centuries in the medical research centers, and she knew his critique came from genuine concern rather than mere cynicism. He had predicted something like this, perhaps not a stellar collapse specifically, but some catastrophic failure born from their civilization's overconfidence and internal divisions. The debate continues, Chronos acknowledged with a slight nod, his hands continuing to manipulate evacuation logistics even as he engaged in philosophical discussion. His multitasking capability was legendary. He could coordinate planetary-scale operations while simultaneously debating the most minute ethical issues. Some ships seek empty worlds for pure reconstruction. Others? He glanced at Thalia, and she felt the weight of his analytical gaze assessing her position. Others wish to find inhabited worlds where our knowledge might serve a greater purpose. Thalia felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her through millennia of healing and research. Even here, even now, watching everything die, she couldn't escape the fundamental drive that defined her, the need to help, to heal, to nurture life wherever she found it. If we encounter younger civilizations, we could guide them. Help them avoid the mistakes that led to this? Erebus gestured toward the dying star with bitter irony, his long fingers cutting through the air like knives. Our guidance created the quantum resonance experiments that destabilized our sun. Perhaps other worlds would be safer without our help. Perhaps the most ethical thing we could do is find some empty planet and isolate ourselves from any species we might contaminate with our particular brand of wisdom. The criticism landed like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, Erebus was never cruel, but because it was accurate. The quantum resonance experiments that had triggered the stellar collapse had been presented as the next phase of their civilization's evolution, a means to harness stellar energy more efficiently and transcend the limitations of conventional power generation. The project had been supported by the best scientific minds, approved by democratic consensus, and implemented with every safety protocol their advanced civilization could devise. And it had killed their sun in 17 hours. The chamber shuddered as another stellar flare washed over their world, and Thalia's medical sensors screamed warnings about radiation exposure approaching lethal levels even for immortal physiology. Through the walls, she could sense the planet's electromagnetic field fluctuating wildly, struggling to maintain coherence against the assault from their dying star. They had minutes, not hours. The protective fields that shielded the command center were failing, as their energy reserves were depleting faster than the backup systems could compensate. Philosophical debates are a luxury we no longer possess, Zephyros said, his architect's pragmatism cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. His hands moved through a final sequence of commands, and the holographic displays shifted to show the evacuation status: 47 ships, 564 passengers in total, 83% of essential supplies loaded, and life support systems at 92% functionality. The final ships launch in 60 seconds. We must choose our path. On the displays around them, Thalia could see the last evacuation ships departing from orbital platforms, surface installations, and the massive generation ships that had been under construction in the outer system. Each carried part of their collective knowledge, their history, their hopes, cultural archives containing 20 million years of accumulated wisdom. Genetic repositories preserve the biodiversity of their entire evolutionary lineage. Technological databases that might enable the reconstruction of their civilization in some distant world. The vessels scattered along different vectors, a diaspora of immortal refugees seeking new homes among the stars. Some headed towards stellar systems their astronomers had identified as potentially habitable, and others simply fled in random directions, hoping that probability and time would eventually deliver them to sanctuary. A few chose suicide vectors, diving into black holes or stellar cores rather than facing endless wandering through the void. Ship designation Sanctuary 7 is ready, Chronos reported, his voice maintaining professional neutrality despite everything. Our assigned vessel. 12 berths, full resource synthesis capability, and a quantum navigation system optimized for long-range travel. We're cleared for immediate departure. Thalia looked around the command chamber one final time, her perfect immortal memory recording every detail for preservation. This had been the heart of their civilization's most incredible city, the place where decisions affecting billions had been made with careful deliberation over centuries. The architecture alone represented millennia of aesthetic refinement, crystalline walls that could shift their molecular structure to create different acoustic properties. These bioluminescent panels responded to emotional states of occupants and gravity fields carefully tuned to provide optimal comfort for different physiological types. Now it would be dust in moments, reduced to ionized plasma when the stellar radiation finally overwhelmed the failing protective shields. The others? She asked, looking toward Zephyros and Chronos. They had worked together for centuries, but she realized she didn't know which ships her other close colleagues had chosen, which paths her friends and mentors would follow into exile. Nyx took the observatory ship. She insists on continuing her stellar research. Zephyros smiled slightly, and despite everything, Thalia found herself almost laughing at the characteristic stubbornness of their leader. Even as they fled extinction, Nyx remained curious about the universe, determined to understand the stellar mechanics that had destroyed their civilization. She's loaded it with every sensor package we could spare. Plans to study stellar phenomena during the journey, collect data that might prevent this from happening to other species. Prometheus chose the fastest vessel, Chronos added with apparent disapproval, his organizational mind offended by anything that prioritized speed over thorough planning. Claimed he wanted to reach a habitable system quickly to begin. Improvements. The pause before improvements carried worlds of concern. Prometheus was brilliant but reckless, a technological revolutionary who saw every problem as something to be fixed through aggressive innovation. The thought of him arriving at a primitive civilization with advanced technology and no oversight made Thalia's medical instincts scream out warnings. Korath took the defense ship, Erebus noted, stepping out of the shadows to join them more fully. Old habits. Still believes he can protect something. As they spoke, their assigned companions materialized in the chamber, responding to Chronos' final boarding call. Sophia arrived first, their master educator, her form shimmering with contained knowledge that made the air around her seem to hum with potential. She carried nothing physical, all her possessions were informational, cultural archives, and educational frameworks stored in crystalline memory matrices that resemble jewelry. Ether came next, the chronicler whose entire purpose was documentation and historical preservation. She was already recording these final moments, her enhanced perception capturing not just sights and sounds, but also electromagnetic patterns, quantum states, and even the emotional resonances of the assembled immortals. Everything would be preserved, archived, and analyzed by future historians who might learn from their civilization's final hours. Korath himself appeared last, solid and protective even in defeat. The warrior guardian's scarred form spoke of millennia spent defending their civilization from external threats, cosmic hazards, rogue AI systems, and the occasional hostile encounter with other spacefaring species. But all his combat prowess, all his strategic brilliance, all his dedication to protection couldn't defend against a sun that decided to die. He carried weapons anyway, plasma rifles, gravitational disruptors, even a few archaic bladed weapons that he'd collected across his long career as if arms might somehow protect them from the fundamental indifference of cosmic forces. The deck beneath them groaned as gravitational forces began tearing their world apart, with tidal stresses from the dying star pulling at the planet's core in ways that exceeded any material's ability to resist. Through the windows, Thalia watched the familiar landmarks of her eternal life crumble into incandescent debris. The towers, where she had conducted research that saved millions, were elegant spires of living crystal that housed the most advanced medical facilities in known space. The gardens where she had walked with Zephyros through countless seasons, discussing architecture and healing, art and science, finding unexpected friendship in the overlap between their disciplines. The archives where Sophia had taught young immortals the wisdom of ages, vast libraries that contained not just data but understanding accumulated over 20 million years. All of it dissolving into superheated plasma as the star's death throes tore their world apart. Time, Zephyros announced, his voice steady despite everything, even though a steady voice meant condemning everyone not in this chamber to death. His hands moved through the final transport protocols with the precise efficiency that had always characterized his work. They moved together toward the transport beam that would carry them to their ship, a column of shimmering light that represented the last technological miracle their dying civilization could provide. As the familiar tingle of matter transmission began, the sensation of being deconstructed atom by atom and reconstructed elsewhere, Thalia took one last look at their dying world. Through the crystalline walls, she could see their sun's final convulsion. The star that had warmed their world for 20 million years, that had enabled their civilization's rise from primitive origins to cosmic sophistication, that had been stable, reliable, and utterly trustworthy according to every astronomical model, was dying in a cascade of fusion failures that would sterilize everything within 10 light minutes. The blast of radiation that followed looked almost beautiful, a sphere of deadly light expanding at relativistic speeds, erasing everything it touched with impartial thoroughness. Cities vanished. Continents burned. Oceans boiled into a vacuum. The planet's atmosphere stripped away in seconds, the protective magnetic field collapsed, and the crust itself began to melt under the assault. Then they were aboard Sanctuary 7, looking through the ship's transparent hull at the expanding sphere of destruction that had been their home. Thalia's stomach lurched despite her immortal equilibrium as the vessel's quantum drives engaged with a harmonic thrum that she felt in her bones, carrying them away from everything they had ever known into the cold infinity of space. The ship itself was small by their civilization standards, maybe 30 meters from bow to stern, shaped like an arrow drop designed by someone who understood both aesthetics and fluid dynamics. The interior was cramped compared to the vast spaces they were accustomed to. Every cubic meter was optimized for long-duration survival. The command center, where they gathered, occupied the vessel's widest point. It was surrounded by sleeping quarters barely large enough for individual privacy, storage bays packed with compressed resources, and the massive drive assemblies that would carry them across interstellar distances. "Where do we go?" Sophia asked quietly, her usual confidence shaken by the magnitude of their loss. The master educator, who had taught thousands of students across the millennia, now sounded like a confused child asking for direction. Her hands trembled slightly as she accessed the ship's navigation systems. Zephyros studied the star charts with professional focus. Still, Thalia could see the grief in his golden eyes and read the tension in his shoulders, which spoke to overwhelming loss barely contained behind practical necessity. They had worked together long enough that she'd learned to interpret his subtle emotional cues, the micro-expressions that most immortals suppressed, the tiny variations in posture that revealed inner turmoil, and the almost imperceptible changes in voice tone that indicated distress. The navigation system has identified 17 potentially habitable systems within reasonable range, he said, his architect's mind already analyzing structural problems even in stellar cartography. Some show no signs of intelligent life. Others? He hesitated, his hand hovering over specific coordinates. Others show electromagnetic signatures consistent with early technological civilizations. Chronos finished, his organizational systems having already processed the complete analysis. Radio transmissions at primitive frequencies. Atmospheric modifications suggesting industrial-scale activity. The signs of species beginning to reshape their worlds. Young civilizations, Thalia said, feeling something stir within her chest. Not quite hope, that would take time to rebuild, might never fully return after watching their entire civilization die. But purpose, perhaps. Direction. A reason to continue beyond mere survival. Species that might need guidance to avoid our mistakes. Or species that might be better left alone to find their own path, Erebus countered, his consciousness carrying the weight of opposition that would define their relationship for the next 50,000 years. Our guidance destroyed our own world. What right do we have to interfere with others? The ancient philosophical divide that had shaped their civilization for millennia was already reasserting itself, even in exile. Around the ship's command center, Thalia could see the others choosing sides with familiar patterns, Chronos and Sophia gravitating toward structured intervention, Nyx and Ether maintaining careful neutrality, Korth torn between protection and non-interference. But that debate would come later. For now, they were refugees among the stars, carrying the remnants of an immortal civilization toward an uncertain future. Whether they would become guardians, observers, or simply survivors remained to be seen. Through the ship's transparent hull, Thalia watched the light of their dying sun fade into just another point of illumination among the countless stars. The explosion that had consumed their world, that had killed billions of their people, that had erased 20 million years of accumulated wisdom and achievement, looked almost small from this distance, just another stellar event in a universe full of such catastrophes. Somewhere ahead lay worlds that might become new homes, species that might become new companions, and choices that would define not just their own survival but the fate of civilizations yet unknown. Behind them lay everything they had ever been, their history, their culture, their confidence in their own wisdom and capability. All of it reduced to memory and regret. Set course for the nearest inhabited system, Thalia said finally, making the choice that would echo across 50 millennia. If we're going to survive, let it be with purpose. We find a young civilization. We learn from our mistakes. And we try to ensure no one else pays the price for knowledge that comes too quickly or power that exceeds wisdom. Zephyros input the coordinates with swift precision, and Sanctuary 7's quantum drives hummed with building energy. Around them, the other immortals settled into positions for long-duration transit, each lost in private grief for what they'd lost, private uncertainty about what they might find. As their ship accelerated toward an unknown blue world orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable stellar system, Thalia stood at the observation window, watching their dead sun recede into the infinite darkness. The light that had sustained their civilization for 20 million years was dying behind them, but ahead lay other lights, other worlds, other possibilities. The journey into exile had begun. And with it, the first steps toward becoming something different than what they had been, no longer masters of their own destiny, but refugees seeking new purpose among the stars. Chapter 2, The Blue Refuge. 3 months later, deep space. The Discovery. Nyx floated in the observatory pod of their ship, surrounded by holographic star charts that painted her pale features with shifting light in shades of blue and violet and crimson. Her silver hair drifted weightlessly around her shoulders, which seemed to carry the accumulated knowledge of their lost civilization like an invisible mantle. Each strand moved in currents created by the pod's life support systems, gentle air circulation that felt wrong after a lifetime on a planet with wind and weather. The observatory was the only place on Sanctuary 7 where she could truly breathe. The rest of the ship felt too small, too confining, too reminiscent of a coffin carrying 12 immortals through the infinite dark. But here, surrounded by holographic representations of stellar phenomena, with transparent walls that allowed her to see the raw cosmos in all its terrible beauty, she could almost pretend they were still explorers rather than refugees. Even in exile, mourning the loss of 20 million years of culture, she could not suppress her fundamental nature. She was driven to understand, observe, and analyze the universe in all its complexity. Some immortals process grief through art, meditation, or quiet contemplation. Nyx processed it through data. Fascinating, she murmured, adjusting the display with delicate gestures that sent new constellations wheeling around her like a private cosmos. Her dark eyes never blinked, an old habit from millennia of astronomical observation, driven by the fear that blinking might cause her to miss some crucial phenomenon in the microseconds her eyes were closed. The electromagnetic signatures from this system are remarkably sophisticated for such a young species. The viewscreen before her showed a small, blue-green world, the third planet orbiting a yellow star in what their charts designated as System 7 Alpha. From this distance, approximately 3 light days out, it appeared as little more than a marble of swirled clouds and shifting continents, beautiful in the way that all living worlds were beautiful, precious in ways that refugees understood better than conquerors. But the data streaming across Nyx's displays told a far more intriguing story than mere geological beauty. Radio transmissions? Thalia's voice carried a note of hope as she materialized in the pod's entrance, her form solidifying from the quantum transport beam with practiced ease. The journey had been arduous for all of them, 3 months of cramped quarters and recycled air and the constant hum of drives pushing them across interstellar distances, but perhaps hardest on Thalia, whose healing nature yearned for patients to treat, lives to save. The sterile confines of their ship offered no outlet for her deepest drives, and Nyx had watched her friend grow increasingly restless as the weeks passed. Not radio, Nyx corrected, her dark eyes never leaving the displays, even as she felt Thalia's presence settle beside her. Something far more primitive, yet somehow more complex. Bioelectrical patterns. Neural activity on a planetary scale. She gestured, and the hologram shifted to show a cross-section analysis of the planet's surface. Scattered across the continents were millions of tiny bright points, heat signatures, movement patterns, the unmistakable signs of intelligence organizing itself into social structures. Camps, settlements, and what might be early villages, all connected by trade routes and migration paths, spoke to a sophisticated social organization. The atmospheric composition indicates early tool use, Nyx continued, her voice taking on the analytical tone that her colleagues knew well, the sound of her mind engaging fully with a problem worth solving. Fire, basic metallurgy in its earliest stages, agriculture in its infancy. But the neural patterns. She paused, studying readings that defied easy classification. I've never seen anything quite like this. The bioelectric signatures were wrong in ways that fascinated her. Too complex for the species' apparent technological level. Too coordinated for a primitive social organization. The neural activity patterns suggested cognitive capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for beings who were still using stone tools and living in hide shelters. Thalia moved closer, her own analytical mind engaging with the mystery. Where Nyx observed from pure intellectual curiosity, the scientists strive to understand purely for the sake of understanding. Thalia's perspective was shaped by millennia of studying biological systems, of understanding how life adapted and evolved, and sometimes transcended its limitations. Her healer's consciousness automatically cataloged everything in terms of health, viability, and survival potential. The brain-to-body ratio is remarkable, she said, highlighting portions of the bioelectric analysis with precise gestures. Far higher than we achieved at comparable technological levels. And the neural complexity. She trailed off, running calculations that sent cascades of data across the displays. Their brains are disproportionately large. Energy expensive. They must require enormous caloric intake to maintain that neural tissue. They're dreaming, Nyx said quietly, zooming in on sleep state neural patterns from the nocturnal hemisphere. Not just individual REM patterns like we've seen in other species, but collective neural structures. They're creating shared mental constructs, stories, beliefs, and abstract concepts that exist independently of individual minds. Art, music, symbolic representation. Mythology, Thalia breathed, her medical consciousness recognizing the patterns. They're creating meaning beyond survival needs. Philosophy, spirituality, and conceptual frameworks for understanding their place in the universe. That's remarkable for such an early-stage civilization. The two immortals studied the data in companionable silence, each processing the implications through their own areas of expertise. Nyx's astronomical training sought to identify patterns in neural activity that might correlate with celestial phenomena. Thalia's medical background analyzed the health implications of such resource-intensive cognitive architecture. Both of them felt the stirring of something that had been absent since they fled their dying world, genuine intellectual excitement about something other than survival. Below them, or rather, ahead of them in three-dimensional space since below was meaningless in the cosmos, the blue world continued its ancient rotation, carrying its cargo of young intelligence through cycles of day and night that had remained unchanged for millions of years. Continents drifted across the viewscreen as the planet turned, vast landmasses separated by even vaster oceans, ice caps at both poles gleaming white against the blue-green of temperate zones, cloud patterns swirling in atmospheric currents that spoke to complex weather systems. "They're vulnerable," Thalia finally said, her healer's instincts responding to what the data revealed about the species' fragility. Her fingers moved through diagnostic displays, pulling up biometric data that made her medical training cringe. Average lifespan appears to be less than a century, maybe 40 to 50 years based on cellular degradation patterns. Susceptible to environmental variations, predation, disease, and resource scarcity. Genetically diverse but not particularly robust. A single disease pandemic could wipe out entire populations. A harsh winter could kill thousands. Yet they persist, Nyx observed, highlighting historical data extrapolated from archaeological evidence visible even from orbit. Population centers recovering from natural disasters. Migration patterns that suggest the need for long-term planning and adaptation. Tool use is accelerating beyond mere survival needs into aesthetic and ritual applications. She adjusted the display to show evidence of early art, cave paintings visible as heat signature variations in certain limestone formations, carved figurines detected through material density scans, and decorative grave goods that suggested elaborate burial customs. The beings down there weren't just surviving. They were creating culture, generating meaning, asking questions about existence that transcended immediate survival needs. "Should we wake the others?" Thalia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. This discovery was too significant for them to process on their own. Whatever they decided about this world would affect not only these unknown beings but also the future of their own scattered people. The debate that had begun on their dying home world would continue here, above this blue world carrying its cargo of vulnerable intelligence. Yes, Nyx agreed, though her eyes remained fixed on the displays as if by force of will alone she could extract every secret the data held. But first, let me gather more data. If we're going to debate the fate of an entire species, we should understand what we're dealing with. We owe them that much. And we owe ourselves the knowledge necessary to make informed choices rather than rushing to intervention or isolation based on incomplete information. Over the next several hours, as their ship maintained its observation position beyond the primitive being's detection capabilities, Nyx compiled a comprehensive analysis of what they had discovered. The picture that emerged was both promising and troubling, the way all complex realities were both promising and troubling once you understood them deeply enough. The species showed remarkable adaptability and creativity, but also pronounced tendencies toward violence and territorial conflict. Their tool use suggested genuine intelligence, not just instinct or imitation, but actual problem-solving and innovation, but their social structure seemed chaotic compared to the ordered civilizations the immortals had known. Resource competition led to warfare, tribal boundaries led to xenophobia. Scarcity led to aggression. Most intriguingly, they displayed an almost compulsive drive to create meaning through symbols and stories, constructing elaborate mythologies to explain phenomena they could not yet understand scientifically. Thunder became the anger of the gods. Seasons became the cycle of divine powers. Death became a transition to other realms. They couldn't yet explain the mechanics of their universe, so they explained its meaning instead. "They're like children," Thalia observed after hours of studying video feeds of the beings engaged in ritual activities around carefully maintained fires. The comparison came naturally to her healer's consciousness. These beings were young, vulnerable, full of potential, but also completely capable of self-destruction. Brilliant, curious children playing with forces they can barely comprehend. Children who could either grow into wisdom or destroy themselves in the attempt, Nix agreed grimly, pulling up projections based on the species' current trajectories. The mathematical models were not encouraging. There is a high probability of catastrophic warfare once their technology advances beyond Stone Age limitations. Significant risk of environmental collapse as populations expanded beyond sustainable levels, moderate chance of disease pandemics that could push them to extinction. She gestured to data showing evidence of warfare, fortified settlements, weapon development, skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death, and environmental degradation, deforestation around major population centers, erosion patterns suggesting unsustainable agricultural practices, evidence of megafauna extinction that correlated with human expansion. "We have to tell the others," Thalia said finally, her voice carrying the weight of decisions she knew were coming, choices that would define not just these beings' future but their own purpose in exile. "This is too important for us to decide alone." Nix nodded, though she continued studying the displays as if trying to memorize every detail before facing the inevitable debate. "They call themselves human," she said softly, pulling up linguistic analysis from intercepted vocal communications. "At least, that's the closest translation I can derive from their neuro-linguistic patterns. The thinking ones. Or perhaps the dreamers. The etymology is ambiguous, their languages are still early stage, grammatically simple but conceptually sophisticated." "Humans," Thalia repeated, testing the word. Something about it resonated, perhaps because it captured both the species' intellectual promise and their essential vulnerability. They were human, mortal, finite, struggling to understand their place in a universe vast beyond their comprehension. And yet they persisted, they dreamed, they created meaning in the face of meaninglessness. "Wake the others," Nix said, finally turning away from the displays with apparent reluctance. "We need to decide what we're going to do with these humans." As Thalia departed to summon their companions, Nix remained in the observatory pod, watching the blue world turn in its ancient patterns. Somewhere on that distant surface, millions of human minds were dreaming their fragile dreams, creating their transient art, building their temporary civilizations in defiance of mortality and entropy. They had no idea that 12 immortal refugees watched from the darkness, that beings from a dead civilization were about to decide their fate. The weight of that responsibility pressed against Nix's consciousness like a gravitational force. They had fled their dying world, carrying the accumulated wisdom of 20 million years. What gave them the right to use that wisdom to shape another species' development? What gave them the right not to, if they possessed knowledge that could prevent suffering? The questions had no easy answers. They never did when the stakes involved entire civilizations. Through the pod's transparent walls, the blue world continued its eternal dance, carrying its cargo of human dreams toward a future that would be shaped by choices made in the darkness above. And in that darkness, an immortal refugee tried to calculate the moral mathematics of intervention, searching for equations that would balance wisdom with humility, help with harm, guidance with autonomy. She found no perfect solutions. Only choices, each carrying consequences that would echo across millennia. The council gathers. The ship's small council chamber felt claustrophobic with all 12 immortals present. Sanctuary 7 had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and the chamber that served as their meeting space was barely large enough for everyone to gather without physically touching one another. They floated in microgravity, arranged in a rough sphere around the central holographic display that showed the blue world in all its vulnerable beauty. Thalia positioned herself near Zephyros, drawing unconscious comfort from his solid presence. Over the 3 months of travel, she'd found herself gravitating toward him more frequently, not romantically, not yet, but with the beginning of something that felt like it might become that, given time and proximity. He understood loss in ways the others didn't, perhaps because his architecture had always been about building things meant to last. Watching their civilization crumble had cut him differently than it had those whose work was more abstract. "Nix has discovered an inhabited world," Chronos announced without preamble, his organizational mind immediately establishing meeting protocols. "System 7 Alpha, third planet. Preliminary analysis suggests early technological civilization. We need to determine our approach." The holographic display expanded, displaying all the data Nix had compiled: bioelectric patterns, settlement distributions, tool use evidence, and neural activity maps. The humans appeared in the display as tiny points of light, millions of them scattered across the continents, each one representing a thinking mind, a dreaming consciousness, a being that might someday ask questions about the stars. "They're beautiful," Sophia breathed, her educator's consciousness immediately engaging with the potential she saw in those neural patterns. The cognitive complexity, the abstract thinking, the drive to create meaning, this species has extraordinary potential. Potential for what? Erebus challenged from his position at the display's edge, as far from the others as the chamber's geometry allowed. Potential to destroy themselves like we did? Potential to repeat every mistake we made across 20 million years of supposed wisdom? Potential to avoid our mistakes if properly guided, Thalia interjected, her medical training focused on prevention and treatment. Look at their mortality rates, they're dying from diseases we could cure with minimal intervention. We could help them predict environmental hazards. Resource scarcity, we could alleviate through basic agricultural knowledge. And in helping them, we would rob them of the growth that comes from overcoming hardship independently, Erebus countered, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical conviction refined across millennia. We would make them dependent on us, would corrupt their natural development, would transform them into something shaped by our choices rather than their own evolution. Prometheus laughed, a sound like crystal chimes in the confined space. Spoken like someone who's never watched a child struggle with a problem they can't solve alone. Sometimes help isn't corruption, Erebus. Sometimes it's compassion. And sometimes it's arrogance disguised as compassion, Erebus shot back. The arrogance that killed our son. The certainty that we knew better than natural processes, that our intervention would improve on evolution's work. The chamber fell into tense silence as the accusation landed. The quantum resonance experiments that had triggered their star's collapse had been sold as improvement, as progress, as the next logical step in their civilization's evolution. Everyone in this chamber had supported them in some capacity, through direct work, through approval, through failure to oppose them strenuously enough. We're not discussing quantum resonance experiments, Chronos said with careful neutrality, his organizational mind recognizing when debates threatened to spiral into unproductive recrimination. We're discussing whether to interact with a primitive civilization. Different parameters, different risks, different ethical considerations. Are they different? Nyx asked quietly, her analytical consciousness finding uncomfortable parallels. We thought we understood stellar mechanics. We were wrong. Now we think we understand how to guide the development of civilizations. What makes us believe we're right this time? The question hung in the microgravity like a physical weight. Through the chamber's small viewport, the blue world was visible as a distant marble, beautiful and vulnerable and utterly unaware of the debate raging in the darkness above it. The alternative is to find an empty world, Korath observed, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through philosophical complexity. Rebuild our civilization in isolation. Avoid contact with other species until we processed our own trauma and failures. Which could take centuries, Sophia pointed out. Millennia, perhaps. And in that time, these humans might destroy themselves through ignorance. We could have prevented it. We would be choosing isolation over compassion, self-protection over moral responsibility. Or we would be choosing humility over arrogance, Erebus replied. Accepting that we don't have all the answers, that our help might cause more harm than our absence. Zephyros had been silent throughout the debate, his architect's mind working through structural implications while the others argued philosophy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different kind of authority, not philosophical or scientific, but practical. We're refugees, he said simply. Whatever we were before, we're refugees now. That changes the moral calculus. We're not masters choosing whether to help primitives. We're survivors deciding whether to share what we've learned at great cost. The question isn't whether we have the right to help them. The question is whether we have the right not to, given what we know and what they face. The reframing altered the atmosphere in the chamber. Thalia felt it immediately, the subtle change in how immortals held themselves, the fractional shift in consciousness through their quantum links. They weren't gods debating how to guide lesser beings. They were refugees deciding what to do with painful knowledge purchased through catastrophic loss. If we choose to help, Ether said carefully, her chronicler's consciousness focused on historical precedent and future documentation, we must do so with extreme caution. Our help must enhance their natural development, not replace it. We must be willing to withdraw if we detect signs of dependency or corruption of their indigenous progress. And who decides what constitutes corruption? Prometheus challenged. Who determines when help becomes harmful? We'll disagree constantly. Erebus will see corruption in any intervention, while I'll see necessary assistance that others call excessive. Then we establish protocols, Chronos replied, his organizational mind immediately engaging with the practical problem. Clear guidelines for intervention. Majority vote requirements for actions beyond established parameters. Regular assessment of our impact against defined metrics. Guidelines written by refugees who just destroyed their own civilization, Erebus observed bitterly. Reassuring. More reassuring than no guidelines at all, Sophia countered. We can't let fear of making mistakes prevent us from trying to do good. Paralysis is a choice too, and it carries its own moral weight. The debate continued for hours, positions staking themselves out along familiar philosophical lines. Prometheus argued for active intervention and rapid advancement. Erebus advocated for complete isolation and non-interference. Between these poles, the others positioned themselves along a spectrum of cautious engagement, each finding slightly different balance points between help and harm. Gradually, reluctantly, a consensus emerged, not through any single persuasive argument, but through the grinding acknowledgement that their options were limited and imperfect. They could find an empty world and rebuild in isolation, potentially condemning themselves to millennia of guilt over species they might have helped. Or they could engage with these humans, accepting the risks of intervention while attempting to minimize potential harm through careful protocols. Vote, Chronos finally declared, his voice carrying the weight of formal decision-making. Limited engagement with the human civilization. Minimal direct contact. The focus is on enhancing natural development processes rather than introducing advanced technology. Regular assessment of impact. Show hands. In microgravity, the gesture was awkward, hands raised in various directions depending on each immortal's orientation to the chamber's arbitrary up. But the meaning was clear, 8 hands raised for engagement, 3 for isolation, 1 abstention. Thalia raised her hand without hesitation, her healer's consciousness unable to ignore the suffering she might prevent. Beside her, Zephyros raised his hand as well, his architect's mind already thinking about how to build systems that would help without overwhelming. Sophia, Prometheus, Chronos, Korath, Nyx, Ether, all voted for engagement, each for different reasons, each bringing different perspectives to what that engagement should look like. Erebus kept his hands at his sides, his vote against engagement clear in his stillness. 2 others, recent additions to the ship from last-minute evacuee transfers, joined his opposition, their faces carrying the haunted look of immortals who had watched their civilization die through excessive confidence. Marcus, the geologist who had transferred from another ship during their final refueling stop, abstained from participating. His scarred face showed the strain of choosing neither option, the burden of recognizing valid arguments on both sides. Recorded, Ether said quietly, her consciousness already documenting this moment for whatever future historians might review their choices. 8 for engagement, 3 for isolation, 1 abstention. We proceed with caution. And with humility, Zephyros added, his golden eyes meeting Thalia's. We help where we can, withdraw where we must, and accept that we won't always know which is which until we've already made mistakes. As the council dispersed, floating back to their various stations and quarters, Thalia remained in the chamber with Nyx, both of them staring at the holographic display of the blue world turning in its ancient rhythms. We're really going to do this, Thalia said softly. Guide another species' development. Shape their civilization. Hope we don't destroy them the way we destroyed ourselves. We're going to try, Nyx corrected gently. And we're going to fail in ways we can't predict. And we're going to succeed in ways we don't expect. And we're going to carry the weight of all of it for the rest of our immortality. Reassuring, Thalia said with dark humor. Truth rarely is, Nyx replied, adjusting the display to show closer detail of human settlements. But it's what we have to work with. Refugees who failed at saving their own civilization are now attempting to guide someone else's. The universe has a dark sense of irony. Through the viewport, the blue world continued its rotation, carrying millions of human minds through their daily cycles of birth and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. They had no idea that 12 immortal refugees watched from the darkness or that beings from beyond their world were about to step into their development, for better or worse. The age of guidance was about to begin. And with it, the age of consequences that neither immortal nor human could fully anticipate. Set course for orbital insertion, Thalia said finally, making the decision that would echo across 50,000 years. We establish a base. We observe. We wait for the right moment to begin. And we hope, Nyx added quietly, that this time, our help actually helps. Behind them, Sanctuary 7's drives hummed with building energy as the ship adjusted course toward the blue world. Ahead lay first contact, first intervention, first mistakes, and first successes in a relationship that would define both species across millennia. The immortals had found their refuge. Now they had to learn how to live in it without destroying what they had come to save. Chapter 3, The Great Debate. 6 months after arrival, Earth orbit, 50,000 BCE. The weight of observation. The ship's council chamber had been designed for harmony, its curved walls flowing like water, its ambient lighting shifting through spectrums that promoted calm contemplation, its acoustic properties ensuring that every voice could be heard with crystal clarity. The architects who had created it millennia ago on their lost home world had believed that proper environmental design could facilitate reasoned discourse, that physical space could shape consciousness toward wisdom. For the past 6 months, every immortal aboard Sanctuary 7 and the 46 other refugee vessels had been watching. Not passively, using instruments to detect quantum fluctuations in neural tissue, probability matrices to predict behavioral outcomes, and sociological models refined over 20 million years of civilization management. The blue world below had been dissected into datasets, its human population analyzed with scientific precision that made poetry of mathematics and tragedy of observation. The holographic displays in the chamber's center now materialized those observations, not abstract, but specific. Individual humans, catalogued and categorized, their lives reduced to data points that nevertheless carried the weight of conscious existence. Chronos's hands moved through holographic displays with mechanical precision, organizing arguments into taxonomic categories as they emerged: ethical considerations, subcategory, consent, practical concerns, subcategory, unintended consequences, historical precedents, 3 subcategories, cross-referenced with homeworld data. His mind demanded structure even in philosophical chaos. Every position needed proper categorization, every argument required appropriate classification, and every conclusion must follow from properly ordered premises. The other immortals found it irritating. He found it necessary. Thalia activated the first dataset, her healer's consciousness organizing the information by medical outcome categories. Case Study 47, The Flint Napper of the Levant. Subject, male, approximately 23 Earth years old. Occupation, toolmaker, specialized in obsidian working. Date, observed 49,823 BCE. Incident, cut left hand on obsidian blade, minor wound. Outcome, infection, progressive sepsis, death after 8 days. Preventable, yes. Basic antiseptic knowledge, 95% survival probability. Intervention status, none, observation protocols maintained. The hologram showed him a specific face, dark eyes focused on his work, skilled hands shaping stone with practiced precision. They'd watched him for 3 months before the accident, documenting his exceptional ability to read stone structures, his teaching methods with younger craftsmen, and his role in his community's social network. Then they'd watched him die. Slowly. Painfully. From a wound that immortal medicine could have prevented with knowledge a child could learn in an afternoon. Case Study 103, The Storyteller of Central Asia. Subject, female, approximately 31 Earth years old. Occupation, oral historian, mythologist, cultural educator. Date, observed 49,791 BCE. Incident, pregnancy, 3rd child, breech presentation. Outcome, maternal death, fetal death, twins, 8-hour labor. Preventable, yes. Basic midwifery techniques, 87% survival probability for all 3. Intervention status, none, observation protocols maintained. The hologram showed her too, telling stories to children gathered around a fire, her hands gesturing, her face animated with the joy of sharing knowledge across generations. They documented 47 unique narrative structures in her repertoire, cataloged her ability to encode complex information in memorable story forms, and measured her social influence across a network of 12 connected communities. Then they watched her die. And the twins. And documented the aftermath, the community's grief, the knowledge lost, the destabilization of social bonds, the children she left behind growing up without her stories. Case Study 89, The Child of North Africa. Subject, female, approximately 4 Earth years old. Date, observed 49,847 BCE. Incident, severe drought, water source contamination. Outcome, dehydration, death after 6 days. Preventable, yes. Water management knowledge, 99% survival probability. Intervention status, none, observation protocols maintained. A child's face. 4 years old. Still learning language, still discovering the world with the unfiltered wonder that made consciousness beautiful. She'd had a laugh that made adults smile, high and straightforward and utterly unself-conscious. They'd watched her die, too. Slowly. Over 6 days, as dehydration shut down her petite body systems one by one. Her parents had tried everything they knew, different water sources, all contaminated, reduced activity, didn't help, prayers to gods who didn't exist, and immortals who refused to intervene, equally ineffective. Nyx's voice cut through the emotional weight of the holographic displays, her analytical consciousness providing the statistical context. 17,431 specific cases documented across 6 months of observation. Categories of preventable death. Infectious disease, 8,441 cases, 48.5%. Traumatic injury, 3,117 cases, 17.9%. Childbirth complications, 2,209 cases, 12.7%. Malnutrition, 1,876 cases, 10.8%. Predation, 892 cases, 5.1%. Other, 896 cases, 5.0%. Average age at death, 23.7 Earth years. Infant mortality rate, 37% before age 5. For those surviving to adulthood, life expectancy, 67 Earth years, compared to our species' practical immortality. Estimated preventable mortality with basic medical intervention, 73%. With advanced medical knowledge, 89%. With full technological intervention, 97%. She paused, letting the numbers settle. We're watching approximately 2,400 preventable deaths per day. Per day. That's 17,000 per week. 73,000 per month. If we maintain pure observation protocols, we'll document roughly 876,000 preventable deaths per year while having the knowledge and capability to prevent approximately 768,000 of them. The chamber absorbed the arithmetic of suffering. Erebus stood at its edge, his dark form seeming to draw the light into himself. His consciousness was clearly troubled, yet his philosophical framework remained unwavering despite the emotional weight of specific faces attached to statistical categories. Korath's presence carried the particular stillness of a warrior processing strategic information. Through the network connecting them, Thalia felt his consciousness overlaying the medical data with tactical considerations, population sustainability, community resilience, the cascading effects of selective mortality patterns. When he finally spoke, his voice carried memories of other worlds, other observations. In our explorations of the outer systems, before the collapse, I visited 17 worlds with evidence of extinct civilizations. Not gradual decline, sudden collapse. The archaeological evidence showed patterns, rapid technological advancement without corresponding social adaptation, environmental exploitation exceeding sustainable limits, warfare using weapons their wisdom couldn't contain. On Kepler 442b, we found ruins of what had been a sophisticated civilization, architecture suggesting mathematical knowledge, art indicating philosophical sophistication, technological artifacts showing they'd achieved metallurgy and early computational systems. Population estimate at peak, 400 million. Cause of collapse, nuclear warfare. Time from first nuclear weapon to extinction, 73 years. They killed themselves with knowledge they developed too quickly. He pulled up holographic reconstructions, crumbling cities, vitrified sand, archaeological evidence of catastrophic warfare. On Gliese 667 CC, the civilization died more slowly. Environmental collapse. They developed agriculture, industry, urban centers, all the markers of advancement. Then they consumed their ecosystem faster than it could regenerate. Time from the Industrial Revolution to extinction, 230 years. They starved on a planet they'd stripped of resources. More ruins. More evidence of consciousness that had reached for greatness and fallen short. On Kepler 186f, they simply stopped. Based on the archaeological evidence, the best we can determine is that they achieved something close to post-scarcity utopia. Automated systems provided everything they needed. And over approximately 400 years, their population gradually declined as they lost the ability to find meaning in existence without struggle. They died of comfort. He turned to face the assembled immortals. 17 civilizations. 17 different paths to extinction. But one common factor, none of them had help. None of them had guidance from a species that had already made these mistakes. If we have the power to prevent waste, to help consciousness survive rather than extinguish itself through ignorance, how can we choose not to use that power? The specific faces in Thalia's medical database seemed to watch from the holographic displays, the toolmaker, the storyteller, the child. Each one was a minor tragedy that, multiplied by millions across millennia, became an argument for intervention more compelling than any philosophical framework could provide. Now, 6 hours into the most consequential debate of their exile, that careful design felt almost mocking. The recycled air tasted stale, not truly stale, the filtration systems were functioning perfectly, but psychologically contaminated. After 6 months of breathing the same molecules, stress pheromones accumulated despite the scrubber's best efforts. Thalia could smell fear underneath the carefully maintained environmental controls, the faint acidity of adrenaline analogs, the subtle shift in carbon dioxide ratios that came from elevated breathing rates, the almost imperceptible ozone tang that immortal anxiety somehow produced through bioelectric field interactions. The chamber's lighting had been cycling through its calming spectrum for 6 hours now, soft blues meant to reduce aggression, gentle greens designed to promote rational thought, warm golds intended to foster cooperation. It wasn't working. The colors just made the argument feel more surreal, like they were debating the fate of a species while trapped inside a therapeutic mood lamp. "They are not our responsibility," Erebus said, his tall form casting sharp shadows that seemed to absorb the chamber's gentle illumination. He stood apart from the others, as was his nature, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction refined across 6 months of constant observation. "We came seeking refuge, not subjects to manipulate." The air in the chamber carried tension thick enough to taste, or maybe that was just the recycled atmosphere of their ship, the same molecules they'd been breathing for months, tinged with the stress pheromones of 12 immortals locked in philosophical combat. Thalia remained seated near the chamber's center, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her entire posture radiated barely contained energy. Her healer's nature yearned to act, to intervene, to prevent suffering she had the power to alleviate. 6 months of watching humans die from causes she could prevent with minimal intervention had worn at her restraint like water against stone. "No one is suggesting manipulation," she replied, though her voice betrayed the strain of hours of circular argument. They'd been at this since dawn, if dawn had meaning in orbit, and the debate had covered the same ground so many times she could predict each participant's arguments before they spoke them. "I'm talking about guidance. Protection. These humans are remarkable, yet incredibly fragile. Their average lifespan is less than 70 years. They're vulnerable to diseases we could cure with minimal intervention, environmental disasters we could help them predict and avoid." Through the transparent walls, Earth continued its rotation below them, or above them, depending on which way they oriented themselves. The blue world turned with serene indifference to the philosophical warfare occurring in orbit. Thalia could see the specific features now, after 6 months of observation: the greening Sahara that wouldn't stay green, the ice sheets that would retreat and advance across epochs, the river valleys where human civilizations would someday rise. Somewhere down there, at this exact moment, a human child was being born. Another was dying. A hunter was tracking prey. A storyteller was preserving knowledge. A toolmaker was discovering something new. A mother was teaching her daughter to gather plants. An elder was passing on accumulated wisdom to the next generation. All of it was happening without any awareness that 12 immortal refugees in orbit were deciding whether to intervene in their development, guide their trajectory, reshape their future. The humans lived and died and struggled and dreamed, utterly unaware that gods from dying stars were watching every moment and debating whether to help. And in saving them from hardship, you would rob them of the growth that comes from overcoming challenges, Erebus countered, his dark eyes fixed on Thalia with the intensity of someone who had spent 6 months formulating this exact argument. "Look at us, look at what our guidance of our own civilization accomplished. We had 20 million years to perfect ourselves, to eliminate every source of suffering and uncertainty. The result? We became so comfortable in our mastery that we never considered the consequences of our experiments until our star was dying around us." The accusation landed like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, Erebus was never cruel, but because it was accurate. Their civilization had spent millennia perfecting every aspect of existence, eliminating struggle and removing uncertainty, creating a society where immortals could pursue any interest without fear of consequence. And that perfection had bred the kind of confidence that led to quantum resonance experiments conducted without adequate safety protocols, stellar manipulation attempted without complete understanding. Prometheus laughed, a sound like silver bells touched with acid that cut through the tension without relieving it. He reclined in his seat with fluid grace, suggesting he was enjoying the debate rather than being troubled by it. His form seemed to shift between states of energy and matter as his emotions fluctuated. "Speak for yourself, Erebus. Some of us were quite aware of the risks. The difference is that some of us believed advancement was worth the danger." The quantum resonance experiments that killed our sun were your design, Chronos observed with mechanical precision, his voice carrying no emotional weight but devastating factual accuracy. His organized mind processed information like a vast analytical engine, considering variables and probabilities with inhuman thoroughness. Your advancement destroyed everything we had built. My advancement also gave us the technology to escape, Prometheus shot back, his form flaring briefly brighter as anger broke through his usual playful effect. Without quantum navigation, we would have died with our world. Progress requires risk, Chronos. Your administrative mind can catalog dangers, but it cannot weigh them against possibilities. You see every potential failure but miss every opportunity that failure might enable. But the memory of his own failure haunted him too, and through the network, he couldn't prevent the others from feeling it. 3,200 years before the collapse. The tertiary moon of their home world's largest gas giant. A colony of 12,000 immortals experimenting with gravity manipulation for faster-than-light travel. Prometheus had designed the experimental field generators. Revolutionary approach. Unprecedented energy efficiency. Probability matrices showed a 94% success rate, excellent by any reasonable standard. He pushed for immediate implementation. The potential benefits were enormous: true interstellar capability, the ability to reach other galaxies, to spread their civilization across the universe. The committee delayed. Wanted more testing. More analysis. More time. He called them cowards. Risk-averse. Holding back progress because they couldn't tolerate uncertainty. They'd compromised, a limited test on the tertiary moon. Small colony. Volunteer subjects who understood the risks. The field generators activated perfectly. The gravity manipulation worked exactly as designed. Then a cascade failure in the containment systems, one he hadn't predicted, couldn't have predicted with the models available, created a localized singularity that consumed the entire moon. 12,000 immortals. Dead in 0.7 seconds. Not his fault, technically. Equipment failure, not a design flaw. The investigation exonerated him. But 12,000 consciousnesses extinguished because he'd pushed for speed over caution, for bold action over careful deliberation. I learned from that, Prometheus said, his voice carrying the weight of permanent guilt. Learned that confidence without humility is just arrogance wearing a clever disguise. But I also learned that excessive caution carries its own body count. For every life lost to reckless innovation, how many are lost to opportunities not taken? How many humans die per day while we debate philosophy? He pulled up Thalia's medical data. 2,400 preventable deaths per day. 17,000 per week. If we delay intervention for another year while we refine our protocols, that's 876,000 specific individuals who die while we theorize about the ethics of helping them. At some point, philosophical purity becomes indistinguishable from moral cowardice. Sophia raised a hand, and the others fell silent out of long habit, the automatic deference given to the master educator, the repository of their civilization's collective wisdom. Where the others embodied specific aspects of their lost culture, such as healing, construction, organization, and analysis, she represented its accumulated knowledge and cultural memory, 20 million years of learning distilled into consciousness. When she spoke, it was with the authority of epics. The question before us, she said in her melodious voice that somehow carried perfectly despite the chamber's acoustics being designed for equality rather than prominence, is not whether we have the right to intervene, but whether we have the right not to. She gestured, and holographic displays materialized around the chamber, showing the data Nix had compiled about the humans over the course of 6 months of constant observation. Population distributions. Disease patterns. Mortality statistics. Cultural developments. Tool use innovations. Art creation. The accumulated documentation of a species struggling toward understanding while battling constant threats from its environment, its biology, and its own kind. This species shows extraordinary potential, Sophia continued, her educator's consciousness cataloging human capabilities with professional appreciation. Their creativity, their adaptability, their drive to find meaning and beauty even in the face of mortality, these are remarkable traits that deserve nurturing. Traits that will develop naturally if left alone, Erebus insisted, but Thalia could hear the slight waver in his voice, the first crack in 6 months of absolute certainty. The data was compelling in ways that philosophical arguments couldn't quite counter. We have no evidence that our intervention would improve their trajectory rather than corrupt it. We have no evidence that it would corrupt it either, Thalia said, leaning forward intently, sensing an opening in Erebus's usual impenetrable certainty. But we do have evidence that they're suffering needlessly. Diseases that kill millions, natural disasters that destroy civilizations, and conflicts that arise from scarcity we could alleviate. 37% infant mortality, Erebus. More than 1 in 3 human children dies before reaching maturity. We could reduce that to single digits with basic hygiene knowledge and simple medical interventions. She pulled up specific data that she'd been cataloging obsessively for months, case studies of individual humans and communities that had died from preventable causes while immortals watched from orbit. A talented toolmaker was crushed by a predator that could have been avoided with better warning systems. This gifted storyteller died from an infected wound that would have healed with basic antiseptics. An entire community of 200 was wiped out by contaminated water supplies that proper engineering could have prevented. These aren't statistics, she said, her voice thick with emotion she'd been suppressing for months. These are thinking beings with hopes and dreams and potential. Every one of them matters. Every preventable death is a tragedy we choose to allow through inaction. Korath had remained silent throughout most of the debate, his solid presence anchoring the chamber like a foundation stone. The warrior protector of their group rarely engaged in philosophical discussions, preferring action over analysis and concrete solutions over abstract arguments. But when he finally spoke, his words carried such decisive weight that everyone paid attention. I have seen species die, he said simply, his scarred hands clasped before him. In our explorations beyond our system, before the collapse, I witnessed civilizations destroy themselves through ignorance, prejudice, and failure to adapt. His voice carried the weight of memories that clearly pained him, archaeological sites showing evidence of nuclear warfare, biological catastrophes, and environmental collapse. If we have the power to prevent such waste, how can we choose not to use it? Because the choice is not ours to make, Erebus replied, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Korath's words had struck home. They all remembered the expeditions to dead worlds, the heartbreaking evidence of species that had reached for greatness and failed for want of knowledge that more advanced civilizations possessed but hadn't shared. Ether, who had been quietly documenting the entire debate from her position at the chamber's periphery, finally looked up from her recording devices. As their civilization's chronicler, she understood better than anyone the weight of historical precedent, the way choices echoed across millennia, how decisions made in moments shaped the trajectory of entire civilizations. As the chronicler activated her historical archives, the chamber's walls dissolved into timeline visualizations spanning their civilization's 20-million-year history. Not abstract, specific interventions, specific outcomes, patterns emerging from the noise of accumulated experience. Our species attempted guided development 17 times across our history, Ether narrated, her consciousness weaving through the data with practiced precision. Not with other species, we never encountered any before now, but with our own populations during various crisis periods. Example 1, the Third Epic Famine, 14.3 million years ago. Environmental catastrophe threatened 40% of our population, leadership implemented controlled resource distribution, mandatory agricultural modification, and centralized coordination. Result, famine contained. Mortality reduced from projected 800,000 to actual 47,000. Success. But the centralized control systems established during the crisis never fully dissolved. For the next 200,000 years, our civilization operated under technically emergency governance that had become normalized. Individual autonomy was compromised. Innovation was channeled through approval systems. We became efficient and stagnant. The timeline showed the pattern. Crisis intervention created systems that persisted long after the crisis passed, with each intervention leaving institutional scars that shaped subsequent development. Example 7, the quantum plague, 8.2 million years ago. A consciousness-targeting pathogen has a 63% mortality rate without treatment. We developed neural modifications to provide immunity. Universal implementation, mandatory participation. Result, species saved. Extinction prevented. But the timeline branched, showing unexpected consequences. The neural modifications designed to prevent the plague also altered cognitive processing in ways we didn't fully understand. For the next 400,000 years, our civilization experienced what historians call the philosophical drought, a significant reduction in creative thinking, pattern recognition, and abstract reasoning. We'd saved ourselves biologically while inadvertently damaging ourselves cognitively. The modifications were eventually reversed, but the lost centuries of intellectual development couldn't be recovered. Pattern after pattern emerged. Interventions solved immediate crises while creating delayed complications. Success is measured in lives saved, but is complicated by compromised autonomy, distorted development, and unintended consequences cascading across epochs. I'm not arguing against intervention, Ether concluded. I'm documenting that intervention always carries costs we don't fully anticipate. Sometimes those costs are acceptable. 47,000 deaths versus 800,000 is clearly a worthwhile trade-off. But sometimes the costs aren't visible for millennia, and by then they've become embedded in the species' fundamental development. Whatever we do here will echo across this species' entire future. We should at least enter it with eyes open to history's lessons. There is another consideration, she said softly, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who recorded history rather than making it. We are refugees now. Exiles. Whatever we were before, we are no longer the masters of our own destiny. Perhaps that changes our perspective on mastery itself. Perhaps failure has taught us humility that success never could. The chamber fell quiet as the implications of her words settled over them like morning dew. They were no longer the immortal architects of a perfect civilization, the masters of stellar manipulation and quantum mechanics. They were survivors, refugees seeking new homes among the stars, beings who had catastrophically failed to manage their own world and were now contemplating whether they had wisdom to offer another species. Did that failure disqualify them from offering guidance? Or did it uniquely qualify them, having learned through catastrophic loss what comfortable success never taught? The human's dream, Nyx said suddenly from her position near the chamber's observation window, her analytical mind still processing the observational data even as the philosophical debate raged. Their neural patterns show constant background activity devoted to imagination, creativity, and symbolic thought. They spend significant mental energy creating meaning rather than merely surviving. That suggests a species with philosophical depth, not just intelligence. They're not just smart, they're conscious in ways that demand ethical consideration. She pulled up neural activity maps that showed human brain patterns during various activities. The data was striking. Even during mundane tasks like food preparation or toolmaking, significant neural resources were devoted to abstract thought, symbolic processing, and meaning creation. Humans weren't just surviving, they were constantly asking why they survived, what it meant to survive, and whether survival itself had a purpose beyond mere continuation. All the more reason to respect their autonomy, Erebus said, but his tone had shifted from absolute opposition to thoughtful consideration. A species with that kind of philosophical sophistication deserves the dignity of finding its own answers. All the more reason to ensure they survive to fulfill their potential, Thalia countered, seeing the debate finally moving beyond entrenched positions toward something resembling productive discourse. What good is philosophical sophistication if disease and disaster kill them before they can fully develop it? Zephyros had been silent throughout most of the debate, his architect's mind working through the structural implications of their choices while the others argued philosophy. Thalia could feel his consciousness through their growing quantum link, not full telepathy, but a subtle awareness of his emotional state, his thought processes, his analytical frameworks. He was troubled by something the debate hadn't yet addressed. When he finally spoke, it was with the careful precision that marked all his creations. Perhaps, he said slowly, choosing each word with architectural exactness, the question is not whether to intervene, but how to intervene responsibly. He gestured, and new displays appeared, showing detailed analyses of human settlements, tool use, and social structures. If we choose to help them, it must be done carefully, subtly, in ways that enhance their natural development rather than replacing it. We must build frameworks that support their growth without creating dependency. Guidance, not control, Thalia said, seizing on the distinction with the intensity of someone who had been arguing for this position for 6 months. Medical knowledge is transmitted through their own healing traditions. Engineering principles discovered through inspired insights. Agricultural techniques that seem to arise naturally from experimentation. We don't give them our technology, we help them develop their own, but faster and with fewer casualties. A dangerous path, Erebus warned, but now he was engaging with the practical implications rather than rejecting the premise entirely. Where do you draw the line between guidance and manipulation? How do you ensure that their achievements remain truly theirs? What prevents well-intentioned nudges from becoming a controlling intervention? I watched our civilization develop safeguards, Erebus continued, his consciousness opening to share a specific memory through the network. The others felt it with him, not just hearing, but experiencing. A council chamber on their home world, 12,000 years before the stellar catastrophe. Young Erebus, only 140,000 years old then, barely adult by immortal standards, standing before the Stellar Engineering Committee. The quantum resonance experiment should be delayed, he argued, presenting probability matrices. Our models show 73% confidence in safe operation, but the 27% failure scenarios include cascading stellar destabilization. We don't understand quantum coupling at stellar scales well enough to. The committee chair, Xanthos, 4.7 million years old, veteran of 400 major engineering projects, cut him off with gentle dismissal. Young Erebus, your caution is noted but overstated. We've successfully manipulated stellar outputs for 800,000 years without a catastrophic incident. The probability matrices you cite include scenarios so unlikely they're essentially mathematical abstractions. Theory must sometimes yield to practical experience. The vote wasn't even close, 47 to approve, 3 to delay, 1 abstention. Erebus's concerns were documented and dismissed. That was 12,000 years ago. Their son died 8 months ago. The memory faded, leaving the weight of vindication that tasted like ash. I was right, Erebus said quietly. And 3.7 million immortals died because the experienced, confident committee members couldn't believe that their practical success might be built on incomplete understanding. They knew better. They'd done this before. What could a young contrarian possibly see that they'd missed? He gestured at Earth below them. Now we're the experienced ones. We're the confident committee. And these humans are the young contrarian voices we'll be tempted to dismiss when they question our guidance. That pattern, certainty breeding catastrophe, it's what killed our world. I won't help it kill theirs. The same way we balance any ethical consideration, Sophia replied, her educator's wisdom focused on the pedagogical model. Through careful thought, constant evaluation, and willingness to change course if we discover we are harming rather than helping. We establish protocols. We create accountability mechanisms. We commit to withdrawal if we detect signs of corruption or dependency. Through the network, Sophia shared her own teaching memories, not of immortals, but of the brief contact they'd had with less developed species during their exploration era. Kepler-62e, 400,000 years ago. A species of aquatic mammals is developing tool use in complex language. Not sentient by immortal standards, but clearly on the path toward it. Sophia had spent 3 generations observing them, watching their slow development of symbolic thought, their gradual emergence of abstract reasoning. She'd been fascinated by how their underwater environment created unique approaches to problem solving. Then she taught one group how to create fire underwater using chemical reactions, just a demonstration. Just showing what was possible. Within 50 years, that single piece of knowledge had spread across their entire population. Within 200 years, they'd developed chemical weapons. Within 500 years, they'd poisoned 40% of their oceans and driven their own population from 2 million to fewer than 100,000. Sophia had watched from orbit as the remaining survivors struggled in increasingly toxic seas, their civilization collapsing under the weight of knowledge they gained too quickly to use wisely. I killed them, Sophia said quietly, the memory still raw despite 400 millennia having passed. Not directly. Not intentionally. But I gave them fire, and they used it to burn their world. The knowledge itself wasn't harmful, fire is just chemistry. But they weren't ready for what fire enabled. Their social structures couldn't contain the power, their ethics couldn't channel the capability, their wisdom couldn't match the knowledge I gave them. She pulled back from the memory, facing her companions. So when I argue for education, I'm not arguing from naive optimism. I'm arguing from terrible experience. The lesson of Kepler-62e isn't don't teach, it's teach wisdom alongside capability. Give knowledge, yes, but give it in ways that include understanding the consequences, appreciating responsibility, and providing frameworks for ethical application. Don't hand fire to children, teach them to respect fire as they learn to use it. And we accept that we'll make mistakes, Ether added, her chronicler's consciousness already documenting this moment for whatever future historians might review their choices. We'll intervene when we shouldn't. We'll withdraw when we should act. We'll misjudge situations and cause unintended consequences. The question is whether those inevitable failures outweigh the good we might accomplish. The debate continued for several more hours, but gradually the positions began to converge around Zephyros's framework. They would intervene, but carefully, subtly, in ways designed to enhance human development rather than replace it. They would provide inspiration rather than direct instruction, guidance rather than control, frameworks rather than solutions. The ship's chronometer showed they'd been debating for 8 hours now. The lighting had cycled through its full therapeutic spectrum 3 times. Several immortals had left briefly for sustenance. They didn't need to eat often, but stress accelerated metabolic processes even in immortal biology. The blue world had rotated enough that the Terminator line had swept across the regions they'd been most carefully observing, and night had fallen on the Levant where the toolmaker had died. Dawn was breaking over Central Asia, where the storyteller had perished. The eternal cycle of light and darkness, oblivious to mortality, continues regardless of whether immortals intervene or observe. Thalia's hands were trembling now, not from physical exhaustion but from emotional overload. 6 months of watching preventable deaths. 8 hours of debating whether to prevent them. The weight of 2,400 deaths per day presses against her healer's consciousness like physical pressure. It was Chronos who finally proposed the formal resolution, his organizational mind reducing their complex ethical considerations to operational parameters. Limited intervention, he declared, pulling up a systematic framework that displayed across all the chamber's walls. Minimal direct contact to prevent cargo cult formation. Enhancement of natural development processes rather than the introduction of foreign elements. Constant monitoring to ensure our assistance does not create dependency or corruption of indigenous progress. Regular assessment of intervention impact against defined ethical metrics. Withdrawal protocols if corruption is detected. The framework was comprehensive, with specific criteria for what constituted acceptable intervention, precise lines that shouldn't be crossed, accountability mechanisms for reviewing their actions, and procedures for correcting mistakes. It was the kind of systematic approach that Chronos excelled at, reducing messy ethical complexity to structured decision-making processes. Voting procedure, he continued. Simple majority for minor interventions within established guidelines. 2/3 majority for actions that push boundaries. Full consensus for major changes to our approach. Any immortal can call for an impact assessment and potential withdrawal at any time. We need to acknowledge what this debate is really about, Thalia said finally, her voice cutting through the circular arguments with surgical precision. We're not just deciding whether to help humans. We're deciding what our survival means. She gestured toward the viewport where their home star would be, if it were visible, if it weren't behind them, if it weren't already dead. We saved 564 immortals. We left 3,699,436 to die. Every one of us in this chamber made choices that day, who to save, who to abandon, what knowledge to preserve, what beauty to sacrifice. We carry that arithmetic in every thought. Through the network, she felt them all remembering, their specific choices, their particular burdens, the faces of those they'd condemned through triage decisions. If we choose pure observation, if we watch these humans die while possessing knowledge that could save them, then what did we survive for? To be eternal witnesses to suffering we refuse to alleviate? To preserve consciousness that refuses to be useful? But if we intervene carelessly, Erebus countered, we risk becoming what destroyed us, certainty without humility, power without restraint, knowledge without wisdom. Then we intervene carefully, Thalia pressed. We acknowledge our trauma. We recognize our limitations. We admit we'll make mistakes. But we don't let our fear of failure justify choosing an action when action could save lives. Nix's voice joined, analytical but carrying unusual emotional weight. Survivor's guilt is affecting this decision. We feel we must justify our survival by being useful. But usefulness motivated by guilt produces problematic outcomes. We'll overcompensate, overreach, override boundaries because we need to prove we deserve to survive. That's not wisdom. That's trauma response. All of this is trauma response, Sophia said quietly. We fled our dying world. We're operating from positions of grief, guilt, and desperate purpose. There's no untainted decision we can make. The question is whether we make trauma-informed choices or trauma-blind ones. Do we acknowledge our compromised state and proceed carefully, or do we pretend we're objective observers when we're actually desperate refugees seeking redemption? The chamber held that truth for a long moment. They were refugees. They were traumatized. They were making civilization-scale decisions from positions of emotional compromise. But they were also the only immortal species in this region of space. The only beings with accumulated knowledge that could help. The only witnesses to human suffering who possessed the capability to reduce it. Purpose or obligation? Redemption or responsibility? Intervention or observation? The debate had circled these questions for 8 hours. Now it was time to choose. One by one, they voted, each immortal's choice carrying the weight of their particular expertise and philosophical orientation. Thalia voted yes, her healer's nature could not ignore suffering she had the power to alleviate. 6 months of watching preventable deaths had worn her restraint to breaking. Zephyros voted yes, but with careful structural safeguards to prevent harm. His architect's mind was already designing intervention frameworks that would support without overwhelming. Sophia voted yes, seeing education as a fundamental good that transcended species boundaries, convinced that knowledge shared responsibly would help more than harm. Korath voted yes, his protective instincts extended to vulnerable populations, regardless of their origin, and his memories of dead civilizations demanded that he act when action might prevent similar fates. Prometheus voted an enthusiastic yes, his nature driving him toward active engagement with new possibilities, though his vote came with promises to restrain his usual impetuosity. Prometheus paced the chamber's perimeter as others spoke, his form flickering with impatient energy that made him appear to occupy multiple positions simultaneously. He interrupted Erebus mid-sentence, characteristic of someone who experienced thought faster than others could articulate. Yes, historical precedent suggests caution, but precedent also shows that caution kills as effectively as recklessness. When he caught himself, forced stillness, let the speaker finish. Restraint was exhausting as his consciousness processed implications in microseconds, while the debate proceeded at a conversational pace. Ether voted yes, reluctantly, understanding the historical significance of their choice and the weight of responsibility it entailed, but convinced that doing nothing carried its own moral burden. Nyx voted yes, her scientific curiosity demanded closer study of human development, and her analytical mind was convinced that careful intervention could be managed responsibly. Marcus, who had remained silent throughout most of the debate, voted yes, his geological perspective focused on long-term planetary processes, making him comfortable with interventions that operated on similar timescales. Erebus voted last, his dark eyes surveying his companions with something approaching resignation. The chamber held its breath, waiting for his response. Yes, he said finally, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 misgivings. But I reserve the right to oppose specific interventions that exceed our agreed parameters. And I will be watching for signs that we are repeating the mistakes that destroyed our world. Consider me your permanent devil's advocate, your constant skeptic, your reminder that good intentions have paved our way to catastrophe before. Agreed, Thalia said, speaking for all of them. Relief flooded through her consciousness, finally released from 6 months of watching preventable suffering while immortals debated philosophy. We proceed, but carefully. We help, but responsibly. We guide, but we do not control. And we listen when Erebus warns us we're going too far. 8 votes for intervention, 0 against, 4 abstentions, Chronos recorded formally. Motion carried. We begin limited engagement with human populations according to established protocols. As the formal debate ended and their companions began dispersing to their various duties, Thalia remained in the chamber with Zephyros, both of them studying the displays that showed human settlements scattered across the continents below. The blue world turned in its eternal rhythms, carrying millions of mortal minds through their daily struggles, utterly unaware that immortal refugees in orbit above had just decided their future. We're really doing this, Zephyros said quietly, his consciousness touching hers through their growing quantum link with a mixture of hope and trepidation. We're trying, Thalia replied, her hand finding his without conscious thought, a gesture of comfort and solidarity that felt natural despite being new. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to cause unintended consequences. We're going to second-guess ourselves constantly. Probably, he agreed, his golden eyes reflecting the blue world below. But we're going to try to help. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth the risk. Through the chamber's transparent walls, the blue world continued its rotation, carrying its cargo of human dreams toward a future that would now be shaped by immortal guidance. Somewhere down there, millions of mortal minds were dreaming their brief dreams, creating their transient art, building their fragile civilizations in defiance of entropy and time. Soon, those dreams would be touched by influences beyond their understanding. Diseases would be cured by remedies that seemed to arise from natural experimentation. Engineering insights would emerge from inspired moments of creativity. Agricultural techniques would develop through apparently fortunate accidents of discovery. The immortals had chosen their path. Now came the far more difficult task of walking it without losing their way, without repeating the mistakes that had destroyed their own civilization, without transforming help into harm through the very certainty that had killed their son. The age of guidance was about to begin. And with it, the age of consequences that would echo across 50,000 years. Chapter 4, The First Touch. 1 year after arrival, the Fertile Crescent, 49,000 BCE, the breaking point. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of what would one day be called the Fertile Crescent, transforming the landscape into something from a dream. Thalia walked through the tall grass with steps so light they barely disturbed the dew, her immortal form shimmering with an opalescent quality that made her seem like a mirage made manifest. The grass whispered against her legs, she materialized clothing that approximated local textiles, though no human eye would mistake her for one of their own if they looked closely enough. The air tasted of morning, that particular combination of cool moisture, warming earth, and plant life beginning its daily photosynthesis cycle. Her enhanced senses catalogued everything, the distant calls of birds she didn't have names for, the rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth, and the faint smoke scent from the settlement ahead, mixing with the organic richness of the river valley. This world smelled different from their lost home world, wilder, less managed, full of chaotic biological processes rather than carefully curated ecosystems. She had been observing this particular human settlement for weeks, learning their rhythms, understanding their needs, preparing for the most delicate intervention of her eternal existence. Every morning, she watched from concealment as they woke and began their daily routines. Every evening, she studied their social structures, their decision-making processes, and their remarkable capacity for cooperation, despite the brutality of their existence. She should not have been here at all. The careful protocols they had established 9 months ago called for indirect influence, subtle guidance through dreams and inspiration. Minimal contact. Enhancement of natural processes. Careful nudges rather than obvious intervention. They had debated for hours, established frameworks, and created accountability mechanisms specifically to prevent what she was about to do. But Prometheus had shattered those protocols 3 months ago with his characteristic impetuosity. Thalia could still remember the moment she detected the anomaly in the northern regions, technological advancements spreading through trade networks at rates that exceeded any natural diffusion pattern. When she investigated, she found Prometheus making direct contact with nomadic tribes, demonstrating advanced fire-making techniques with his own hands and teaching metallurgical principles that should have taken centuries to develop naturally. His gifts had spread like wildfire through human communication networks, creating a crisis of premature technological advancement that threatened to destabilize dozens of communities. Tools appeared that required knowledge beyond what the communities possessed to maintain. Techniques spread that depended on resources only available in specific regions. Social hierarchies shifted as those with advanced knowledge gained disproportionate power. The northern tribes were fragmenting, their traditional structures unable to accommodate the sudden technological leap. Violence was increasing. Communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations now competed for resources needed to implement the new techniques. The careful balance of Stone Age existence had been disrupted by knowledge that arrived too fast, without the cultural framework to support it. Now Thalia crouched behind an outcropping of limestone overlooking the settlement, watching the morning activities unfold with growing urgency. The dangerous knowledge was spreading inexorably southward, carried by traders and wanderers who had no understanding of its implications. Her monitoring equipment showed the trade networks lighting up with information exchange. Within days, possibly hours, Prometheus's gift would reach this peaceful community and transform their world in ways they were utterly unprepared to handle. She had to act, even if it meant violating every guideline they had so carefully constructed. Through her scanning equipment, she could see the bioelectric signatures of approximately 200 humans as they began their morning routines. The settlement was nestled in a natural depression where 3 streams converged, their waters providing both irrigation for early agriculture and protection from predators. Humans had been here for 3 generations, developing sophisticated relationships with their environment and creating cultural traditions that balanced resource use with sustainability. They were about to be overwhelmed by knowledge they couldn't safely implement. In the village center, a young woman was tending the communal fire pit, carefully arranging dry grass and kindling with practiced efficiency. Her name was Asha, at least, that was the closest approximation Thalia could derive from the complex tonal language the humans used. She was perhaps 25 years old by human reckoning, with intelligent dark eyes that tracked details with the focus of someone responsible for critical community functions, and hands that spoke of countless hours spent crafting tools, weaving cloth, and preparing food for her extended family. Thalia had been watching Asha for weeks, recognizing in her the particular combination of intelligence, social position, and temperament that made her ideal for what needed to happen. The young woman held respect without being threatening to male leadership structures. She was creative without being reckless. She taught others without being domineering. In a different era, in a different world, she might have been a doctor, an engineer, or a teacher, someone who used her intelligence to help her community thrive. Instead, she was a fire tender in the Stone Age, and she was about to become something more. Asha struck flint against steel, poor quality steel traded from distant tribes, already showing the spread of Prometheus's interference, creating sparks that caught in the tinder and bloomed into flame. But Thalia could see the frustration in her movements, the way her shoulders tensed with each failed attempt before success came. The steel was unreliable, the technique uncertain, the entire process laborious in ways that could prove fatal during harsh winters when fuel was scarce and efficient fire-making meant the difference between survival and death for the entire community. Soon, very soon, traders would arrive with knowledge of advanced fire-making techniques that these humans could not safely implement. The result would be the same explosive technological growth followed by social collapse that Thalia had documented in the northern tribes unless she intervened first. But intervention meant breaking protocols. It meant acting unilaterally. It meant doing precisely what they had agreed not to do, making direct modifications to human biology without complete consensus, without careful review, without the safeguards that were supposed to prevent another catastrophe like the one that had killed their son. Thalia's hands trembled slightly as she activated her medical equipment, despite a mortal physiology that shouldn't permit such displays of emotion. The choice before her was impossible: follow protocols and watch this community collapse, or break protocols and potentially cause different harm through premature intervention. She chose intervention. Closing her eyes, she extended her consciousness toward the human settlement, feeling for the delicate neural patterns that govern learning, memory, and innovation. Each mind was unique, a constellation of synaptic connections shaped by genetics, experience, and the indefinable spark that made consciousness possible. The complexity was staggering even to her immortal perception, billions of neurons firing in patterns that created thought, emotion, memory, intention, consciousness itself. To modify such patterns without causing damage required precision that pushed even immortal capabilities to their limits. One miscalculation could trigger seizures. Excessive modification could cause personality changes or cognitive deficits. Too minor an enhancement would be insufficient to help them handle incoming technology. Too much would make them dependent on immortal intervention, precisely what their protocols were designed to prevent. Forgive me, she thought, knowing that what she was about to do would forever change not just these humans, but the entire trajectory of their species. Forgive me for the help I'm about to give, and forgive me for the harm that help will cause. The enhancement. Thalia began with Asha, since the young woman's role as fire tender made her a natural focal point for technical innovation. With gossamer touches that existed more as probability adjustments than physical interventions. Quantum manipulations at the synaptic level that made specific neural pathways slightly more likely to form, she enhanced Asha's pattern recognition abilities. The modification was subtle, almost invisible in its implementation. A few neurotransmitter receptor sites shifted their sensitivity thresholds. Several dendritic spines strengthened their connections. Growth factors that promoted neural plasticity received gentle encouragement. Nothing that would show up on even sophisticated brain scans, nothing that would mark Asha as obviously different from her peers. But the effects would be profound. Enhanced pattern recognition would enable Asha to understand better the relationships between fuel types, airflow, and combustion efficiency. She would see connections that had always been there but had remained invisible to unenhanced perception. The way different woods burned at different temperatures. The relationship between kindling arrangement and flame propagation. The role of air circulation in maintaining steady combustion. Next, Thalia strengthened the neural pathways associated with sequential reasoning, the ability to understand cause and effect chains, to predict outcomes based on initial conditions, to construct mental models of complex processes. This would enable more sophisticated problem-solving, better troubleshooting when techniques fail, and an improved ability to experiment and learn from the results. Most subtly, she adjusted the neurotransmitter balances that govern curiosity and persistence. A slight increase in dopamine response to novel information would make Asha more likely to experiment. Enhanced serotonin regulation would reduce the discouragement that came from failed attempts. Modified norepinephrine patterns would increase focus during challenging tasks. The changes were infinitesimal, microscopic adjustments to brain chemistry that would manifest as moments of insight, flashes of inspiration, or sudden understanding of principles that had been just beyond reach. To Asha, it would feel like natural learning accelerated and clarified, like the fog lifting from concepts she'd always struggled to grasp. To an immortal observer with advanced sensors, it was clearly an artificial enhancement of cognitive capability. But that was only the beginning. Working through the early morning hours as the village slowly awoke, Thalia carefully touched the minds of every human in the settlement. Her medical consciousness moved from person to person with the precision of a master surgeon, each enhancement tailored to the individual's role, capabilities, and existing neural architecture. The hunters received improved spatial reasoning and pattern recognition, enhanced abilities to track prey, predict animal behavior, and understand terrain advantages. Their visual processing centers underwent subtle improvements, enabling them to notice details that others might miss. Their motor cortex received refinements that would improve coordination and reaction speed. The craftsmen gained enhanced fine motor control and material intuition, unconscious understanding of how different substances would respond to manipulation, improved hand-eye coordination, and better spatial visualization of three-dimensional forms. Their sensory processing improved, enabling them to perceive subtle texture and weight differences that guided their work. The storytellers developed better memory retention and linguistic complexity, enhancing their ability to recall information precisely, improving pattern recognition in narrative structures, and employing more sophisticated use of metaphor and symbolism. Their language centers showed particular enhancement, enabling more nuanced communication and more efficient information transmission. The changes cascaded through the community's social networks like ripples in a pond, each enhancement enabling further enhancements through social learning. Enhanced hunters shared their improved tracking techniques with others. Upgraded craftsmen created superior tools and weapons that were accessible to everyone. More capable storytellers preserved and transmitted knowledge with unprecedented accuracy, creating reliable information repositories in a world without writing. Each improvement enabled further improvements, creating a feedback loop that accelerated development, which Thalia watched with a mixture of pride and horror. Within hours, the settlement's efficiency had increased dramatically. Fires burned brighter and longer with less fuel. Asha's enhanced pattern recognition had led her to discover optimal kindling arrangements and airflow principles that her unenhanced mind would have taken years to understand. Hunting parties returned with larger kills and fewer injuries. Improved spatial reasoning allowed for better coordination and more effective pursuit strategies. Craftsmen produced goods of startling quality using the same materials they had always worked with. Enhanced motor control and material intuition translated existing knowledge into superior execution. Most remarkably, humans began spontaneously developing innovations that bridged different areas of expertise. Hunters applied tracking principles to agriculture, noticing patterns in plant growth that suggested better planning strategies. Craftsmen used toolmaking techniques to create new musical instruments, recognizing that the principles of shaping would apply to sound production. Storytellers encoded technical knowledge in memorable narrative forms, creating oral textbooks that preserved complex information across generations. By midday, when the first traders arrived from the north carrying Prometheus's dangerous gifts, they found a community that was ready for them. The test. Thalia watched from her concealment as the northern traders demonstrated their advanced fire-making techniques to a gathered crowd of villagers. There were 3 traders, 2 men and a woman, all bearing the characteristic signs of prolonged travel: sun-darkened skin, lean frames suggesting variable food access, eyes that held the wariness of those who regularly encountered strangers in a world where strangers could mean death. The lead trader, a scarred man who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, produced a fire-starting kit that was dramatically superior to anything the local community possessed. High-quality steel, perfectly shaped flint, and tinder treated with resins that caught sparks with remarkable efficiency. In any normal human settlement, such a demonstration would have caused excitement, confusion, and ultimately social disruption. Some individuals would try to monopolize the new knowledge, hoarding techniques and materials to gain an advantage over their peers. Others would struggle to understand the principles, becoming frustrated and potentially violent when they couldn't replicate what they'd seen. Status hierarchies would shift chaotically as those with advanced knowledge gained power while traditional leaders found their authority undermined. Instead, Asha stepped forward with calm confidence and examined the trader's tools and methods with the systematic thoroughness of a master craftsman. Her enhanced pattern recognition immediately identified the key principles: the quality difference in the steel, the specific angle of the flint strike, and the chemical properties of the treated tinder. Within minutes, she had not only understood the techniques but also begun mentally cataloging how they could be adapted to local materials and conditions. "The firestone catches the spark metal differently than ours," she said in the clicking, tonal language of her people, her enhanced linguistic capabilities allowing her to describe concepts her language had no existing words for. She was creating new vocabulary in real time, generating terms that bridged the gap between her understanding and her ability to communicate. The sharp edge meets the hard surface at the angle of most sparks. The catch grass has been changed, touched by something that makes it eager for fire. The traders exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her analysis. The lead trader had probably expected confusion, maybe some superstitious fear, possibly attempts to steal his superior tools. Instead, he was facing someone who understood his techniques well enough to reverse engineer them from observation. The change touches tree blood, he said, using his own people's term for resin. Gathered from the weeping bark trees in our northern forests. It makes the catch grass hungry for sparks. Asha nodded thoughtfully, her enhanced cognition already working through alternatives. We have no weeping bark trees here, but the valley trees produce sticky sap when wounded. Perhaps a similar change touch could be made. Within hours, she had not only replicated the trader's methods but also improved upon them, creating fire-making systems that were simpler, more reliable, and better adapted to local materials. The trader's resin-treated tinder worked excellently but required resources only available in specific regions. Asha's alternatives used locally sourced materials, making the technique sustainable rather than dependent on long-distance trade. The other villagers watched and learned with unprecedented focus and comprehension. Rather than creating hoarding behaviors and social conflict, the new knowledge was quickly integrated into the community's existing systems and shared according to well-established protocols. The dangerous technologies became tools for communal benefit rather than sources of divisive competition. Most importantly, and this was what made Thalia's breath catch with relief, the villagers recognized instinctively when they were encountering knowledge that exceeded their current capacity to implement safely. When the traders described more advanced metallurgical techniques that would require mining operations and large-scale fuel collection, Asha listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and then acknowledged that such methods exceeded the capabilities of their community. These are knowing things for when we are more, she said, using the enhanced linguistic structures her modified brain had generated to express future conditional concepts. We will remember for teaching, preserve in stories, wait for the time when our hands can hold what your words offer. She was creating information storage protocols, Thalia realized with amazement. Storing advanced concepts and narrative frameworks that could be preserved across generations, waiting to be retrieved when the community had developed a sufficient foundation to implement them safely. It was precisely the kind of wisdom that protocols were designed to promote, accepting knowledge gratefully but implementing it carefully, recognizing limitations rather than pushing recklessly beyond sustainable development. The crisis passed. The northern traders departed with innovations of their own, Asha's locally adapted fire-making techniques and several agricultural insights the village had developed through enhanced observation of plant growth patterns. The dangerous knowledge that might have destabilized the community had instead been integrated thoughtfully, enhancing their capabilities without overwhelming their social structures. The village returned to its daily rhythms, but now with capabilities that would ensure not just survival but prosperity for generations to come. The revelation. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Thalia painfully of her lost home world's evening colors, she finally emerged from her concealment. The time for hiding was past. The intervention was complete. Now came the moment of truth. Would the enhanced humans recognize what she'd done? Would they understand? Would they accept it, or would recognition of immortal manipulation destroy the trust necessary for guidance to work? She walked openly through the village, allowing the humans to see her clearly for the first time. Her immortal nature was obvious but not threatening. She appeared as a woman of indeterminate age, her skin bearing a subtle luminescence that suggested otherworldly origins, like moonlight made flesh. Her clothing seemed to shift between different fabrics and styles as she moved, quantum uncertainty making it impossible to focus on exact details. Her eyes held depths that no human gaze could match, consciousness that spoke to lifetimes beyond mortal comprehension. The villagers saw her and stopped their evening activities. No panic, no fear, just sudden quiet attention as they recognized something fundamentally different walking among them. Enhanced pattern recognition allowed them to perceive her true nature more clearly than unmodified humans could have. Asha approached her first, as Thalia had known she would. The enhanced pattern recognition capabilities made it inevitable that the fire tender would notice the correlation between the strange visitor's presence and the day's remarkable developments. Her mind would trace the timeline, the mysterious sense of clarity that had come with dawn, the improved capabilities that seemed to emerge naturally but unnaturally fast, the presence of someone who looked human but clearly wasn't. "You have given us something," Asha said quietly, her dark eyes meeting Thalia's with a directness that spoke of enhanced confidence and clarity. Her voice carried no accusation, no anger, just careful observation and the question that followed naturally from observation. "I cannot name it, but I can feel it. My mind works differently than it did this morning. More clearly. More completely." The enhanced linguistic capabilities were already showing. Asha was using abstract concepts her language barely had vocabulary for, generating new grammatical structures to express ideas about consciousness and cognition that her people had never needed to articulate before. You already possess these capabilities, Thalia replied truthfully, her voice carrying harmonics that made human ears recognize it as speech despite its inhuman qualities. They were always part of your potential, written in your genes, encoded in your neural architecture, waiting for the right trigger to express. I merely helped you access them more readily. It was technically accurate, which was the only kind of truth that mattered when speaking to beings whose enhanced cognition could detect lies through micro-expression analysis and linguistic pattern recognition. Humans possess the genetic potential for the enhancements. Given another 100,000 years of natural selection, they might have evolved similar capabilities organically. Thalia had simply accelerated the process, guided its expression, and ensured it manifested in ways that were stable and sustainable. Why? Asha asked, the single word carrying the weight of profound philosophical inquiry. The question hung in the evening air like incense, pressing against Thalia's consciousness with force that made her immortal composure waver. Why indeed? To preserve a single human community from the chaos of premature advancement? To prevent the spread of technological disruption that could destabilize entire regions? To satisfy her own need to heal and nurture, even when the patients were an entire species? To prove that she could succeed where Prometheus had failed, that careful intervention could work if done with sufficient wisdom and restraint? All of those reasons were true. None of them was the whole truth. Because you matter, Thalia said finally, knowing that the answer was both entirely accurate and entirely inadequate. Your dreams, your hopes, your brief lives, they have value beyond measurement. If I can help you achieve your potential while avoiding unnecessary suffering, how can I choose not to? We are refugees, Asha. We fled our dying world carrying knowledge purchased through terrible loss. If that knowledge cannot help others, then what was the point of preserving it? Asha nodded slowly, her enhanced comprehension processing the answer through multiple analytical frameworks, testing it for consistency and weighing it against observed actions. Will there be others like you? She asked. More light bringers with gifts we cannot name? Perhaps, Thalia admitted honestly, because lying to beings she just made better at detecting lies seemed counterproductive. Your world is changing, Asha. Knowledge spreads faster than wisdom. Technology advances more quickly than understanding. You and your descendants will face challenges that no human community has ever encountered before. When those moments come. She paused, choosing her words carefully, knowing they would be remembered perfectly by enhanced memory and transmitted precisely through improved linguistic systems. When those moments come, you will not face them alone. We watch from beyond. We wait for times when help is needed. We provide what assistance we can without replacing your own choices, your own growth, your own achievements. The fire tender smiled, the expression transforming her face with warmth that reminded Thalia why she had chosen to risk everything for these fragile, mortal, infinitely precious beings. Enhanced emotional intelligence allowed Asha to perceive Thalia's sincerity, her genuine care, her deep commitment to helping without harming. Then we will be ready, Asha said simply. We will remember this day. We will teach our children about the Lightbringer who touched our minds and made us more. We will honor your gift by using it wisely, by sharing it carefully, by ensuring that what you gave us helps rather than harms. As Thalia walked away from the settlement, fading into the gathering darkness like morning mist touched by sunlight, she carried with her the memory of that smile and the weight of irrevocable change. She had saved a single human community from the chaos of premature technological advancement. But in doing so, she had fundamentally altered the trajectory of their entire species. The enhancements would spread. Generation by generation, the modifications would be passed down through genetic inheritance and cultural transmission. Enhanced children would teach enhanced techniques to enhanced peers, raising everyone's capabilities through social learning. Communities with modifications would outcompete those without it, creating selection pressure that would spread the changes across the entire human population within a few thousand years. Humanity would develop more rapidly, think more clearly, and adapt more successfully to changing conditions. They would avoid many of the pitfalls that had plagued other species' development, and they would achieve wonders that would have been impossible without immortal intervention. But they would also become something that had never existed in the universe before, a species shaped by immortal guidance from its earliest stages of development. Whatever they ultimately became, it would be as much a product of immortal choices as human potential. The boundary between natural and artificial would blur until it became meaningless. Every achievement would carry the question, did they accomplish this, or did we enable it? The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, as she listened to the distant sounds of human voices raised in songs that now carried more complex harmonies and deeper meanings, enhanced linguistic capabilities expressing themselves through artistic creation, Thalia found herself filled with something approaching hope. They had chosen to care for this species. Now came the far more complex task of learning to care for them well, of balancing help with autonomy, of providing support without creating dependency, of enabling achievement without replacing it. The return. She materialized back in Sanctuary 7's medical bay after activating her quantum transport, the familiar tingling of matter transmission giving way to the sterile environment of immortal technology. The bay smelled wrong after hours in the natural world, recycled air without the richness of earth and plant life, chemical cleaners without the organic sense of human habitation, perfect temperature control without the variation that made environments feel alive. Zephyros was waiting for her, his solid form somehow making the cramped bay feel less confining. She'd known he would be. They'd developed an unconscious habit of checking on each other after challenging assignments, a pattern of mutual support that had grown organically over their year of exile. "You did it," he said, not a question but an observation. His consciousness touched hers through their quantum link, reading the emotional aftermath in ways that no amount of immortal composure could hide. Direct intervention. Full enhancement package. Unilateral action. "Yes," Thalia said simply, too exhausted from hours of precision neural manipulation to offer elaborate justification. "And I'd do it again." The alternative was watching them be destroyed by knowledge they couldn't handle. "At least now they have a chance. The others will be furious," Zephyros observed without judgment. "Erebus will say you proved his point about inevitable overreach. Chronos will protest the violation of protocols. Even Sophia might question whether the intervention was premature." "I know," Thalia said, her hands starting to shake now that the immediate crisis was past and the adrenaline equivalent was draining from her system. "But I couldn't watch any more, Zephyros. Months of observation. Documenting preventable suffering. Following protocols, while humans died from causes I could have prevented with minimal intervention. Watching Prometheus's recklessness spread while we debated proper response procedures. Something had to break. It might as well be protocols rather than my sanity." Zephyros moved closer, his hand settling on her shoulder with the kind of steady presence that had sustained her through countless difficult moments over the past year. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "The protocols were designed for ideal conditions. But we're not operating in ideal conditions. We're refugees trying to help a species we barely understand using frameworks designed for a civilization that no longer exists. Does that make what I did right?" Thalia asked, needing to hear his perspective, even though she knew he wouldn't give her easy absolution. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But it makes it understandable. And it makes the results the best test of our protocols we could have designed. If your intervention helps, it proves that carefully targeted enhancement can be effective. If it causes problems, it proves Erebus's concerns about inevitable overreach. Either way, we learn." Through the medical bay's viewport, the blue world was visible, turning in its eternal rhythms. Somewhere on that surface, in a valley between three streams, 200 enhanced humans were beginning to understand what had changed in them, were starting to explore the edges of their new capabilities, were taking the first steps toward a future that would be shaped by immortal choices as much as human potential. Behind her, in the valley she'd left behind, the village fires burned brighter and steadier than any human community had ever achieved before, carrying light into a darkness that would never be quite as deep again. The age of direct intervention had begun. The age of consequences would follow, as surely as dawn followed darkness, as inevitably as refugees became guides, as indeed as help became harm when wisdom failed to match intention. And Thalia would carry the weight of that arithmetic for the rest of her eternal existence, counting the lives saved against the autonomy compromised, measuring the benefits enabled against the dependency created, trying to calculate the moral mathematics of intervention in a universe that offered no perfect solutions, only choices and consequences echoing across millennia. The first touch is complete. Thalia's enhancement spreads through the Stone Age village like ripples in a pond. Enhanced cognition flows from parent to child, hunter to hunter, teacher to student. Within generations, the entire community has been upgraded beyond natural parameters. They think faster. See patterns their ancestors couldn't recognize. Learn skills that should take decades in mere years. It looks like success. It feels like salvation. But Thalia has just created something unprecedented in the universe, a species shaped by immortal choice rather than natural evolution. And no one knows if that's help or violation, gift or curse, enhancement or contamination. The cascade has begun. There's no stopping it now. And deep in orbit, Nyx runs her analysis. She discovers something that makes every immortal's consciousness ring with alarm. Earth doesn't host one human species. It hosts 5. Homo sapiens, the ones Thalia enhanced. Neanderthals, robust, sophisticated, perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. Denisovan, thriving in high mountains where oxygen kills other hominins. Floresiensis, tiny but brilliant, surviving on resource-limited islands. Erectus, ancient, enduring, 2 million years of survival. All intelligent. All viable. All are worthy of the term human. But immortal enhancements only work on one species. The genetic modifications Thalia designed are species-specific. Attempting to enhance all 5 would fail catastrophically, creating biological instabilities that could kill entire populations. The enhanced humans will outcompete their cousins through pure capability advantage. Choosing to help one species means condemning 4 others to extinction within 5,000 years. In chapters 5 through 8, the immortals face their first impossible choice. Which species lives? Which 4 die? Thalia visits a Neanderthal valley, 43 individuals living lives of quiet sophistication, teaching their children, creating art, preserving knowledge across generations. She watches them, knowing that the vote being made in orbit will erase them from existence. Then comes the Watchers Network, 12 immortals positioned at sacred sites across 6 continents, linking consciousness through quantum communication. They coordinate observation, share data, and immediately discover that enhanced humans aren't just using their improvements, they're improving the improvements through mechanisms immortals don't understand. The cave artists create masterpieces with impossible sophistication, perfect perspective, and anatomical precision. Star charts predicting eclipses generations in advance. And hidden in those images, documentary evidence of immortal intervention, preserved in ochre and manganese for 40,000 years. The language makers gather in the Caucasus Highlands, nearly 1,000 enhanced humans creating a unified communication system in 3 days instead of 3 centuries. They're not just sharing words. They're pooling collective intelligence. Creating distributed cognition networks using Stone Age infrastructure. The students are learning faster than the teachers can teach. That's chapters 1 through 4 of The First Awakening, The Origin complete. 4 species are about to face judgment. 1 will be chosen. 4 will be condemned. And the immortals will learn that every solution creates 3 new problems. Chapters 5 to 8, The Acceleration Drops, Schedule / is available now. What would you choose? If you could only save one species, which one deserves survival? Drop your answer in the comments. There are no easy answers, but the question demands consideration. This is AI Narratives and Tales. The acceleration begins in chapters 5 to 8. Subscribe. Enable notifications. The story is just beginning.